In the space where legends blur into reality, where destiny takes physical form and ancient powers sleep within crystallized fragments of creation itself, there exists a world where the very fabric of fate can be gathered, person by person, star by star. This is not a tale of chosen ones marked from birth, but rather a story of how ordinary souls, when united by purpose and bound by tragedy, can reshape the course of history itself. This is the complete chronicle of the Gate Rune War, a conflict that would topple an empire, resurrect the dead, and prove that even cursed power, wielded by reluctant hands, can become the instrument of liberation. Before we can understand the fall of empires and the gathering of destinies, we must first journey back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this particular story, but the beginning of everything. The origin point from which all conflict, all power, all possibility itself flows. For in the world of Suikoden, creation is not abstract philosophy, but tangible history, written in text that can be discovered, read and understood by those who seek knowledge of what came before. In the beginning, there was darkness. Not darkness as the absence of light, but darkness as a conscious entity, existing alone in a rift outside of time itself. For eons beyond counting, darkness existed in complete solitude, suffering in isolation so profound that no mortal mind could comprehend its depths. The loneliness became so overwhelming, so absolute in its totality, that finally, after ages of silent agony, darkness wept. A single tear fell into the void, and from that tear of infinite sorrow, two brothers were born. They were called Sword and Shield, and they embodied opposing principles so fundamental that their very names contained their essence. Sword proclaimed that he could cut through anything, any substance, any force, any barrier that existed in any reality. Shield countered with equal certainty that he could defend against anything, withstand any assault, protect against any threat imaginable. These were not mere boasts or sibling rivalry, but statements of cosmic truth. They were not beings who possessed these abilities, but rather the living embodiment of the concepts themselves. Sword did not carry the power to cut, he was cutting. Shield did not have the ability to defend, he was defense. For 7 days and 7 nights the brothers fought. Their battle raged across dimensions that human language cannot adequately describe, through spaces where physics bent into impossible configurations, in realms where time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously, or perhaps did not flow at all. Every clash between them sent ripples cascading through the very foundations of existence itself, each impact reshaping reality in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Sword struck with precision and force that could unmake the building blocks of creation. Shield endured with resilience that denied the concept of destruction itself. Neither could overcome the other, for they were perfectly matched, two halves of a fundamental duality that defined the nature of existence. On the 7th night, as their battle reached its climax, both brothers shattered. The fragments of Sword scattered upward and became the sky, vast and encompassing, stretching across all possible horizons. The broken pieces of Shield fell downward and formed the earth, solid and enduring, providing foundation for all that would follow. But the battle had created more than just physical geography. The sparks that flew from their countless collisions, those brilliant moments when irresistible force met immovable object, scattered across the newborn cosmos and became the 108 stars. These were not ordinary celestial bodies, not simple points of light marking positions in the night sky. They were the stars of destiny, each carrying within it a fragment of that primal conflict, each destined to find bearers among humanity individuals who would be drawn together in times of great upheaval to shape the course of history itself. The brothers had worn 27 jewels between them, adorning their forms as symbols of power and beauty. These jewels did not shatter with their bearers. Instead, they transformed, crystallized, became something that was simultaneously new and ancient. They became the 27 true runes, artifacts of immense power that govern the fundamental aspects of existence itself. Each true rune embodies not just an element or force, but the very concept in its purest form. The true rune of fire is not merely able to command flames. It is fire in its truest essence, the principle of combustion and transformation, given physical form. The true rune of water represents not just liquid, but the concept of flow itself, of adaptation, of life-giving nourishment that shapes landscapes over eons. The Soul Eater, also known as the rune of life and death, consumes the spirits of the dying, feeding on mortality itself. The rune of punishment brings suffering to its bearer, even as it grants terrible power. And the sovereign rune, said to represent absolute rule itself, grants dominion and authority to those deemed worthy of wielding it. These true runes possess something that elevates them far beyond mere magical artifacts. They have consciousness, purpose, desires that operate on timescales measured in centuries and millennia rather than human lifetimes. They choose their bearers, binding to individuals who resonate with their fundamental nature, and they grant gifts that can seem like blessings or curses depending on perspective and circumstance. Immortality, allowing a bearer to watch centuries pass, while everyone they love ages and dies around them. Immense power, sufficient to reshape nations, redirect the flow of history, alter the very landscape itself, and always, always a price. The true runes use humanity as much as humanity uses them, pursuing goals that span time, periods longer than recorded civilization, engaging in conflicts that predate and will outlast any mortal empire or kingdom. This cosmic architecture, this framework of destiny and power, forms the foundation upon which our story is built. A world where fate is not abstract but tangible, where it can be read in the stars and altered by those who gather the bearers of those stars together. A world where power beyond imagining exists in physical form, contained in runes that glimmer with ancient purpose on the hands of those they have chosen. It is a world both magical and merciless, where the supernatural and the mundane intertwine so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. And it is into this world, in the year 457 of the solar calendar, that we descend to a nation called the Scarlet Moon Empire, where corruption festers in the heart of what was once a golden age. The Scarlet Moon Empire sprawls across the Toran region, a vast territory surrounding the Great Lake Toran, its borders defined by natural barriers and centuries of military conquest. The empire has existed for over 200 years, founded by Cranach Rugna, who took advantage of civil war tearing through the Great Harmonian Empire to the north to declare independence and establish his own dynasty. The Rugna family has ruled ever since, their authority enforced by military might and legitimized by possession of the sovereign rune, a true rune representing absolute rule itself, embedded within the hilt of the legendary Dragon King sword. Under Rugna leadership, the empire has known periods of both glory and decline, expansion and stagnation, enlightened rule and corrupt tyranny. The current emperor, Barbarossa Rugna, the 17th to bear that title, carries a story both tragic and complex. He was born the sixth son of Emperor Michaelin. So far down the line of succession, that no one seriously considered him a potential heir to the throne. This distance from power granted him an unusual childhood for imperial nobility. He was largely ignored by the tutors and advisors who focused their attention on his older brothers, those who actually had realistic chances of inheriting the empire. This neglect proved to be a strange blessing. While his brothers were molded and shaped by the rigid protocols of imperial education, Barbarossa was free to explore his own interests, to play with commoner children in the streets of Gregminster, the imperial capital, to study subjects that fascinated him rather than only those deemed appropriate for future rulers. He developed empathy and understanding for the lives of ordinary citizens in ways his brothers, isolated in their privileged educations, never could. But fate, it seems, has a sense of irony. 2 of Barbarossa's older brothers fell ill and died, victims of diseases that ravaged the imperial family with cruel precision. As Emperor Michaelan watched his carefully groomed heirs perish one after another, he began to see troubling patterns in his surviving sons. They had grown soft from their privileged positions, corrupt from the flattery and manipulation that surrounded potential heirs, weak in the ways that matter when empire-ending crises emerge. The emperor made a decision that shocked the entire court. He named Barbarossa the overlooked sick son, the commoner's friend, the boy who had been allowed to grow up half wild in the streets, as his crown prince and heir. When Michaelan died, Barbarossa ascended to the throne and inherited both the sovereign rune and the impossible burden of ruling an empire. His early reign lived up to the promise of his unconventional upbringing. He understood the common people in ways emperors rarely did. He could see the problems plaguing the empire from perspectives that courtiers and nobles, isolated in their wealth and privilege, remained blind to. His wisdom and his genuine concern for his subjects' well-being earned him respect and admiration throughout the empire. This was an emperor who seemed to embody the best traditions of the Ragnar dynasty, combining strength with compassion, authority with understanding. Then came the War of Succession, and everything changed. While Barbarossa was away from the capital dealing with matters of state, his uncle Gael Rugnar saw opportunity in his absence. Gael was ambitious, bitter about being passed over for the throne despite his own royal blood, and cunning enough to recognize that Barbarossa's absence created a perfect window for seizing power. He orchestrated what he called the Trial of Disinheritance, a legal proceeding designed to strip Barbarossa of his claim to the throne on various manufactured grounds. With Barbarossa unable to defend himself in person, and with Gael controlling the narrative within the capital, the trial succeeded. Barbarossa was officially declared unfit to rule, and Gael claimed the throne for himself. What followed was civil war. Not all of the empire accepted Gael's coup. Barbarossa, though dispossessed of his crown, retained the loyalty of some of the empire's greatest military commanders. 6 generals in particular stood by him, warriors of surpassing skill and character who believed in Barbarossa's right to rule and were willing to stake their lives and careers on that belief. These became known as the 6 Great Generals. Tir McDohl, called the Ever Victorious for his unbroken string of military successes. Qasim Hazil of the Blue Moon, a tactical genius whose strategies seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. Milich Oppenheimer, the Flower General, whose love of beauty did not diminish his ruthlessness in combat. Deathblow Georg Prime, whose swordsmanship was legendary even among legendary warriors. Sonia Schulen, who commanded the Empire's fleets with iron discipline. And Iron Wall Quander Osman, whose defensive strategies had never been breached by any enemy force. Supporting these military titans was Leon Silverberg, a strategist whose brilliance was matched only by his enigmatic nature. Leon could read battlefields the way scholars read texts, seeing patterns and possibilities that remained invisible to others. With Leon providing the strategic framework and the 6 great generals executing his plans with devastating effectiveness, Barbarossa's forces, though initially outnumbered and outpositioned, began winning battle after battle. The civil war raged for months, tearing the empire apart, brother fighting brother, families divided by loyalty to either the rightful heir or the usurping uncle. Cities changed hands. Armies clashed in fields that had never before known warfare. The death toll mounted into the tens of thousands. During this dark period, Barbarossa married a woman named Claudia, and in her he found something precious beyond any throne. She was his emotional anchor, the one person who could reach through the stress and trauma of civil war to remind him of who he truly was beneath the armor and the crown. She saw him not as emperor or general, not as symbol or political entity, but as a man. Their love became his refuge, the one pure thing in a world consumed by violence and political maneuvering. Then she died. The circumstances varied depending on who told the story, but the end result was always the same. Claudia, the woman Barbarossa loved more than his empire, more than his throne, was taken from him. Some said illness, some said accident, some whispered darker possibilities involving assassination plots that went tragically awry. The loss wounded Barbarossa deeply, leaving a scar that would never fully heal, but he pressed forward with the war that still needed winning. Despite his grief, Barbarossa's forces prevailed. Gael Rugner was defeated, his supporters scattered or executed. His brief reign ended in the same violence that had brought him to power. Barbarossa reclaimed his throne, entering Gregminster in golden armor that caught the sunlight and seemed to make him glow with divine radiance. The citizens, weary of war and grateful for its ending, hailed him as the Golden Emperor, a title that would follow him for the rest of his reign. He had restored order, reunified the empire, proven his right to rule through both blood and victory. It should have been his greatest triumph. The Golden Emperor began his second reign by doing what was expected of him. He governed, made decisions, maintained the empire's stability. But over time, the weight of loss and the endless demands of rule began to take their toll. Court officials, recognizing opportunities in an emperor distracted by the burdens of governance, began pursuing their own interests. Positions that were supposed to serve the public good became opportunities for personal enrichment. Tax collectors added extra percentages that went into their own pockets, rather than the imperial treasury. Military commanders requisitioned supplies and then sold them on black markets. Judges accepted bribes to alter their verdicts. Each act of corruption was small, individually insignificant, but together they formed a cancer eating away at the empire's foundations. Outlying provinces far from the capital and the emperor's theoretical attention suffered worst. Taxes increased while services decreased. Banditry flourished as law enforcement became too corrupt or incompetent to stop it. Pirates raided coastal villages with impunity. The people began to suffer, and their suffering went unnoticed by the emperor who had once understood their lives so intimately. Then Windy entered Barbarossa's life, and the empire's decline accelerated. Windy, the court magician, a woman of extraordinary beauty and considerable magical power, bore half of the Gate Rune, one of the 27 true runes. Her influence over the emperor grew steadily, whether through genuine connection, political manipulation, or the subtle workings of her true rune fragment, remained a matter of speculation among those who observed from distance. To the court, to the public, it appeared that Barbarossa was falling under her sway, that decisions increasingly reflected her counsel rather than his own judgment. The truth was complex. The sovereign rune protected Barbarossa against direct magical control, granting immunity to mental manipulation. But Windy's influence operated on more subtle levels, through advice and suggestions, through exploiting the Emperor's weariness and his diminished engagement with governance. She became the voice he listened to most consistently, the advisor whose counsel shaped imperial policy. Whether this was calculated manipulation on her part, or whether Barbarossa was simply allowing someone else to bear burdens he no longer wished to carry, remained unclear, even to those closest to the throne. Under Windy's influence, or rather under Barbarossa's willing abdication of responsibility, the Scarlet Moon Empire continued its decline. What had begun as scattered corruption became systematic exploitation. The gap between rich and poor widened into a chasm. The imperial capital Gregminster, where the wealthy and powerful resided, became increasingly isolated from the reality of life in the provinces. In Gregminster, one could believe the empire was thriving, could see only prosperity and culture and refinement. But travel just a few days outside the capital's walls, and a very different picture emerged. Villages where people struggled to afford food after paying the oppressive taxes. Towns where bandits operated openly because the Imperial Guard was nowhere to be found. Regions where local officials had become petty tyrants, ruling through fear and violence without any check on their power from distant Gregminster. This was the state of the Scarlet Moon Empire in the year 457 of the solar calendar. An empire with a glorious history and a corrupt present, ruled by a once great emperor who had lost interest in ruling, manipulated by a magician whose purposes remain mysterious to most observers, suffering under the weight of systematic exploitation, while the capital remained blissfully ignorant of the gathering storm. And into this powder keg of resentment and suffering, several crucial elements were about to be introduced. A young man bearing one of the most cursed true runes in existence. A resistance movement led by idealists and veterans who refused to accept the Empire's descent into tyranny, and the gathering of the 108 stars of destiny, drawn together by forces beyond any individual's understanding or control. But before we can understand how these elements would combine to topple an empire, we must first understand their origins. We must journey back to a small village that no longer exists, to witness the beginning of a curse that would follow one boy for 3 centuries before finding its final bearer. We must see how the Soul Eater, one of the 27 true runes, came to rest on the hand of a young man who never asked for power and would spend the rest of his life paying the price for accepting it. 300 years before the Gate Rune War, in the year 150 of the solar calendar, there existed a village so well hidden that even the most detailed maps of the Empire made no mention of its existence. This was by design. The village of the Hidden Rune had been founded centuries earlier by people who understood that some kinds of power were too dangerous to be known about, too terrible to be allowed into the wider world. The village existed for one purpose: to guard the Soul Eater, to keep it sealed away, to prevent it from ever being used by anyone for any reason. The Soul Eater is one of the most feared true runes in existence, and for good reason. Unlike runes that govern elements or concepts, the Soul Eater deals in something more primal and more terrible: mortality itself. It grants its bearer power over life and death, the ability to consume the souls of the dying. to convert the spiritual essence of the deceased into raw magical energy. But this power comes with a curse so terrible that those who know of it consider the rune more curse than blessing. The Soul Eater manipulates fate itself, creating situations where people close to its bearer die, providing the rune with sustenance, feeding the endless hunger that defines its existence. A bearer of the Soul Eater finds that anyone they care about, anyone they form bonds with, anyone they allow into their heart, begins to die. Not always immediately, not always obviously because of the rune's influence, but consistently, inevitably, as if death itself is drawn to anyone the bearer loves. It could be accident, illness, violence, any of the 1,000 ways mortality claims human beings. But the pattern becomes undeniable after enough losses. Care about someone while bearing the Soul Eater, and you have sentenced them to death. Allow yourself to love, to form deep connections, to build relationships, and you are feeding those you love to the rune's insatiable hunger. The psychological weight of this curse is crushing. Bearers of the Soul Eater learn to isolate themselves, to push away anyone who tries to get close, to live in solitude not from preference, but from the terrible knowledge that proximity to them is lethal. The village of the hidden rune had protected the Soul Eater for generations, each generation passing down both the burden of guardianship and the knowledge of why that guardianship mattered. They lived in deliberate obscurity, hiding from the wider world, ensuring that no one who might seek the rune's power could find them. It should have worked. It had worked for centuries, but in the year 150, their defenses failed. Windy came to the village, accompanied by Yuba, a mysterious warrior whose motivations seemed to involve sowing chaos for its own sake. She was not yet the court magician, not yet the manipulator of emperors. She was simply a woman bearing half of the gate rune, driven by purposes known only to herself, searching for true runes to collect and study and potentially use for goals that would not become clear for years. Together with Yuba, and possibly others who participated in the assault, these forces represented power the village could not hope to withstand. The attack came without warning. Windy's gate rune allowed her to summon creatures from other dimensions, and she used this power to devastating effect. Monsters poured into the village from portals that ripped open in the air itself. Creatures that should not exist in the natural world, tearing through buildings and people with equal abandon. Yuba cut down any who tried to mount organized resistance, his swordsmanship far exceeding anything the villagers could match. The village of the hidden rune burned, its centuries-long mission ending in a single night of fire and blood and screaming. In the chaos of the attack, the village chief, an old man who had borne the Soul Eater for longer than most people lived, made a desperate decision. He found his grandson, a boy named Ted, probably no more than 10 or 12 years old, still young enough to have hope and innocence despite growing up in the shadow of the terrible rune they guarded. The old man removed his glove, revealing the Soul Eater emblazoned on his right hand, the mark that identified him as current bearer of the cursed power. He took Ted's hand, pressed their palms together, and spoke words that would echo across centuries. The transfer of a true rune is not a simple matter of moving an object from one person to another. These are not rings to be slipped off fingers or amulets to be removed from chains. They are bound to their bearers at a fundamental level, fused into the very essence of who they are. Transferring a true rune requires both willing release by the current bearer and willing acceptance by the new one. It is a ritual, a moment of profound significance, where power and curse and destiny all shift from one soul to another. The old man called upon the Soul Eater to depart his body and accept Ted as its new host. The rune, which had sustained the chief for decades beyond normal human lifespan, which had watched him lose everyone he cared about to its hunger, which had made him a prisoner of his own power, responded to his command. The mark burned itself into Ted's hand, searing through flesh and bone, becoming part of him in ways that went far beyond the physical. Power flooded through him, knowledge of what the rune could do, understanding of what it would cost. The old man, now freed from the burden he had carried for so long, aged rapidly as decades of accumulated time caught up to him in seconds. He had only minutes at most before death claimed what had been delayed for years. He used those minutes to give Ted his final commands and his final gift of knowledge. There was a secret passage, he explained, that led out of the village, away from the slaughter currently consuming their home. Ted must take that passage, must run, must survive, and ensure that the Soul Eater never fell into Windy's hands. The curse that had made the old man's life a prison of isolation was now Ted's to bear, and he must bear it away from here, must keep it hidden from those who would use its power without understanding or caring about its cost. Ted ran. He left his grandfather behind to face Windy and death, fled through the secret passage as the village burned above him, escaped into the wider world with the Soul Eater marking his hand and destiny marked on his soul. He was perhaps 12 years old, suddenly alone in a world he knew nothing about, bearing one of the most powerful and most cursed true runes in existence, hunted by forces he could not hope to fight. He ran because it was all he could do, because his grandfather had died to give him that chance, because the alternative was allowing Windy to claim the Soul Eater and use its power for purposes he could not even imagine. For 300 years, Ted wandered. The Soul Eater kept him alive, granting the terrible gift of immortality that meant he would watch the world change around him while he remained forever young, forever haunted by the memories of everyone the rune had taken from him. He tried to form connections in those early years, tried to hold on to his humanity by caring about people despite the risk. But the pattern was always the same. He would settle somewhere, begin to feel safe, start to care about the people around him, and then they would die, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always inevitably. The rune needed to feed, and it fed on those Ted cared about. After the first century, Ted stopped trying to connect with people. He traveled alone, spoke to others only when absolutely necessary, kept his distance from anything resembling emotional attachment. He became a ghost moving through the Ihor world, there but not really present, existing but not truly living. The loneliness was crushing, but at least it meant no one else had to die to feed the curse he carried. He wore gloves to hide the rune's mark, avoided questions about his past, disappeared from places before anyone could get close enough to see the truth of what he was. By the year 300 of the solar calendar, 150 years into his wandering, Ted had grown so weary of existence that he was willing to try something desperate. He encountered the fog ship, a mysterious vessel that sailed through mist between worlds, captained by an equally mysterious guide who offered Ted an escape from his curse. "Give up the Soul Eater," the guide suggested, "and we will keep it safe while you rest, removed from the world, freed from the burden of bearing it." Ted, exhausted by a century and a half of isolation and suffering, agreed. He transferred the rune to the fog ship guide and allowed himself to be taken out of the world into a kind of exile that was also rest. He remained there for decades, existing in a space outside of normal reality, aging slowly without the Soul Eater sustaining him, growing from the boy he had been when he accepted the rune into a young man removed from time's normal flow. He was at peace, or as close to peace as someone who had lived his life could be. The weight of the curse was gone. No one was dying because of him. He was safe, and more importantly, everyone else was safe from him. It should have been enough. It should have been the end of his story. But then he encountered Laszlo, bearer of the Rune of Punishment, another cursed true rune that slowly killed its host, and something in Ted changed. He saw in Laszlo someone suffering under a burden similar to his own, someone bearing power they never asked for and paying a terrible price for that power. But where Ted had eventually chosen exile and escape, Laszlo was choosing to fight, to use the Rune of Punishment despite its cost, to protect others even knowing it would kill him. There was courage in that choice, a refusal to surrender to despair that Ted had long ago lost. Watching Laszlo, seeing that determination, rekindled something in Ted that he thought had died centuries ago. The desire to matter, to make a difference, to be more than just a cautionary tale about the danger of true runes. The fog ship guide, who had kept the Soul Eater safe for all those decades, was unwilling to part with it. The guide had grown fond of the rune's power, or perhaps possessive of it, in the way beings sometimes become possessive of terrible things they have held too long. A battle ensued, Ted and Laszlo fighting together against the guide, and when the dust settled, Ted had reclaimed the Soul Eater. The mark burned itself onto his hand once more, the curse settling back into his soul like a familiar weight. He had chosen to return to the world, to once again bear the burden he had tried to escape, because Laszlo's example had shown him that sometimes the cursed and the suffering still have roles to play in shaping the world. Ted aided Laszlo through the war between the island nations and the Kuluk Empire, using the Soul Eater's power to protect and support despite knowing what that use would eventually cost. When the war ended, he departed once more, returning to his wandering existence, moving through the world as a ghost who tried not to care too much about anything he encountered. The decades passed. He drifted north from the island nations to the continent, watching kingdoms rise and fall, seeing the Scarlet Moon Empire grow from a rebel province of Harmonia into a power in its own right, never staying anywhere long enough to form the connections that would inevitably result in death. Then, approximately 150 years after reclaiming the Soul Eater from the Fogship Guide, in the year 457 of the solar calendar, Ted's wandering brought him to Gregminster, capital of the Scarlet Moon Empire. And there, in the household of General Tir McDohl, one of the Empire's 5 great generals, Ted finally allowed himself to hope that perhaps he could find something resembling a normal life. Teo offered him a place in his household, not as servant, but as friend and companion to Teo's son. Ted accepted, recognizing that this was probably a mistake, that caring about these people would inevitably lead to their deaths, but unable to resist the pull of human connection after so many centuries alone. And for a while, it worked. Ted became part of the McDohl household, living in comfortable quarters in their mansion in Gregminster, spending time with Teo's son, a young man approximately 18 years old, who had inherited his father's sense of honor without yet developing his father's cynicism. The son treated Ted as an equal despite the apparent age difference, as a friend rather than a subordinate, and Ted found himself responding to that treatment in ways he had not allowed himself to feel for over a century. He was happy, or as close to happy as someone bearing the Soul Eater's curse could be. He knew it would not last, He knew the rune would eventually claim those he cared about. But he allowed himself the luxury of pretending, for just a little while, that he could have this. The household also included Pan, a guard loyal to Teo, whose devotions sometimes exceeded his common sense. Cleo, a skilled warrior and administrator who helped manage the McDohl estates. And Gremio, a servant who had been with the family since before Teo's son was born, who cared for the young master with devotion that bordered on the parental. These people became Ted's family, the first family he had allowed himself in centuries, and he treasured every moment with them while dreading the inevitable moment when the Soul Eater's hunger would claim them. That moment came sooner than he expected. Ted's service to the Empire took him to Mount Seifu, where he and several Imperial soldiers, including Teo's son, were tasked with dealing with bandits who had been raiding trade routes. The mission should have been routine, a simple exercise to give young nobles some experience with real combat before committing them to more serious campaigns. But they encountered something unexpected. An ant queen, a massive insect creature far more powerful than anything that should have been in that region, accompanied by drones that attacked with coordinated efficiency that suggested either extraordinary intelligence or supernatural coordination. The battle went poorly. Imperial soldiers fell to the ants' mandibles and stingers, their training insufficient against creatures that did not fight like human opponents. Ted found himself defending Teo's son, using the Soul Eater's power to obliterate the ants that swarmed them, drawing deeply on the rune's abilities in ways he had avoided for years. The Ant Queen fell to their combined efforts, its massive body collapsing and dissolving into the strange ichor that served as its blood. They returned to Gregminster victorious but shaken, having faced mortality more directly than the young nobles among them had ever experienced before. But victory on Mount Seifu brought Ted to the attention of people he had spent 300 years trying to avoid. Windy, now serving as court magician to Emperor Barbarossa, learned that the boy who had escaped from the village of the Hidden Rune centuries ago was in Gregminster, living in the household of General Tir McDohl. She recognized her opportunity. For 300 years she had been searching for the Soul Eater, the rune that had escaped her grasp when the village burned. Now it had delivered itself to her doorstep, residing in the capital city itself, close enough to simply take if she moved quickly and decisively enough. Windy acted with calculated precision. She arranged for a summons from the Imperial Palace, calling Ted to appear before the Emperor supposedly to recognize his service on Mount Seifu. Ted, having lived for 3 centuries and developed instincts that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations, recognized the summons for what it was, a trap. But refusing a direct Imperial command would bring consequences down on the entire McDohl household, would make them accomplices to his defiance, would put them in precisely the kind of danger he had spent his life trying to protect people from. So he went, knowing he was walking into an ambush, hoping he could navigate whatever waited for him without causing harm to those he had come to care about. The palace reception started formally enough, Emperor Barbarossa making perfunctory comments about Ted's service, Windy standing beside the throne watching Ted with eyes that saw through his disguises and defenses. Then the formality dropped. Windy demanded that Ted remove his gloves, wanting to confirm what she already knew, wanting to see the Soul Eater's mark with her own eyes after centuries of searching. Ted refused, understanding that admitting to bearing a true rune would give Windy legal justification to take it from him, that true runes were considered property of the Empire, that revealing what he carried was essentially surrendering it. The confrontation escalated quickly. Windy used her magic to try to forcibly remove Ted's gloves, and he used the Soul Eater's power to defend himself. The throne room became a battlefield, spells and counterspells flying between court magician and rune bearer, guards scrambling to either assist or simply avoid being caught in the crossfire. Ted was powerful, the Soul Eater granting him abilities that rivaled Windy's considerable skill. But he was also trying to avoid killing anyone, trying to escape without adding to the body count that the rune would inevitably claim from those he cared about. Windy had no such restrictions. She attacked with lethal intent, determined to either capture Ted or kill him and take the Soul Eater from his corpse. Ted managed to escape the palace, fleeing through streets he had walked peacefully just hours before, now hunted by Imperial guards and Windy's summoned creatures. He made it back to the McDohl mansion, his sanctuary that was about to become a prison. Imperial forces surrounded the household, not yet attacking, but making clear that Ted was trapped, that there would be no second escape. Teo was away on campaign, absent when his household faced this crisis, unable to leverage his position as Great General to protect those under his roof. Inside the mansion, Ted made the decision he had been avoiding for 300 years. He had to leave, but simply running away would not be enough. Windy knew what he carried now. She would pursue him relentlessly, and her pursuit would inevitably endanger anyone who helped him or even showed him kindness. The Soul Eater had to be passed to someone else, someone who could bear its power and its curse, someone who might be able to protect it better than Ted had managed. He looked at Teo's son, this young man who had treated him as a friend, who had welcomed him into his household without suspicion or calculation, who represented everything Ted had wanted to protect and would now burden with the heaviest curse in existence. The transfer happened in the mansion's private chambers, away from curious eyes and Imperial surveillance. Ted removed his glove, revealing the Soul Eater's mark glowing against his palm. He explained what it was, what it did, what accepting it would mean. The curse of watching everyone you care about die to feed the rune's hunger. The blessing of power sufficient to reshape the world if you were willing to pay the price. The impossibility of removing it once accepted, save through transferring it to another or through death itself. He was honest about all of it, or as honest as someone could be when explaining something so terrible that language struggled to contain it. Teo's son, whose name was Tir McDohl, though history would remember him by many other titles, accepted the Soul Eater. Not because he wanted power, not because he understood what he was accepting, but because Ted had become his friend, and friends help each other when help is needed. The mark burned itself into Tir's right hand, the transfer completing as Tir felt the rune settle into his soul, becoming part of him in ways that would take him months to fully understand. Ted, now free of the burden he had carried for 3 centuries, aged visibly, the accumulated years suddenly catching up to him. He did not die as Tir's grandfather had when transferring the rune, his fogship exile having somehow reset the clock, but he was no longer sustained by the rune's power. He was simply a young man, mortal and vulnerable, freed from the curse, but also stripped of the terrible immortality it granted. He told Tir to run, to escape Gregminster, to flee into the world and keep the Soul Eater away from Windy and anyone else who might seek to use its power. Then Ted departed through secret passages that honeycombed the mansion, built centuries ago for exactly situations like this, making his own escape while drawing off pursuit. Windy's forces lost track of him in the chaos, uncertain which of the fleeing figures actually bore the Soul Eater, unable to capture either Ted or Tir before both escaped into the sprawling city and the countryside beyond. Tir fled Gregminster with Gremio and Pain, his most loyal retainers, men who followed not because they understood what was happening, but because their devotion to the McDohl family transcended questions of politics or personal safety. They made their way north from the capital, traveling through territories where the Empire's authority grew weaker with each mile, where imperial law became more suggestion than absolute rule. They did not know where they were going, had no plan beyond putting distance between themselves and Windy's hunters, trusting that opportunity would present itself if they could stay free long enough to find it. Their flight took them to Lennenkamp, a small town far enough from Gregminster that news of the capital's politics arrived slowly and distorted. They tried to settle there temporarily, Tir hoping to catch his breath and figure out what to do with the power now burning in his hand. But even Lennenkamp was not remote enough. Imperial soldiers arrived within days, searching for a fugitive bearing a stolen true rune, authorized to use any force necessary to retrieve it. The garrison commander recognized Tir from descriptions, and the peaceful refuge transformed into another trap. They escaped again, this time with help from an unexpected source. Victor, a mercenary with distinctive facial tattoos and a past shrouded in carefully maintained mystery, intervened during the garrison's attempt to capture Tir. He was large, powerfully built, wielding an enormous sword with the kind of easy competence that came from decades of practice. With him was Humphrey, a quiet warrior whose skills matched Victor's own. Together, they cut through Imperial soldiers with efficiency that suggested this was not their first time defying the Empire's authority, creating chaos that allowed Tir and his companions to escape, while Victor and Humphrey covered their retreat. Victor had his own reasons for helping, reasons he did not immediately share. He led them to a hidden fortress in the forest, a place called the Mountain Hideout, where those who opposed the Empire gathered in secret. This was the headquarters of the Liberation Army, a resistance movement that had been quietly building strength while the Empire grew increasingly corrupt. Here, rebels and idealists plotted against imperial authority, stockpiling weapons, training fighters, waiting for the moment when they would be strong enough to challenge the Scarlet Moon Empire directly. The Liberation Army was led by Odessa Silverberg, niece of the legendary strategist Leon Silverberg, who had helped Barbarossa win the War of Succession, where her uncle had chosen to serve the Empire. Odessa had chosen to rebel against it, her keen mind and noble ideals driving her to organize resistance despite understanding exactly how dangerous such rebellion was. She was young, in her mid-20s, but she possessed natural leadership qualities that inspired loyalty and confidence in those who followed her. She spoke with passion about returning the Empire to what it had been under Barbarossa's early rule, about overthrowing the corruption that had infected every level of government, about creating a nation that served its people rather than exploiting them. Odessa saw Tir's arrival as providence, a bearer of a true rune, son of one of the Empire's great generals, trained in combat and strategy, marked by destiny through circumstances beyond his control. She asked him to join the Liberation Army to lend his power and his name to their cause. Tir was reluctant. He had not left Gregminster to start a revolution. He had simply wanted to escape Windy, to keep the Soul Eater out of her hands, to avoid having anyone else die because of him. The idea of leading armies and overthrowing empires felt impossibly large, a weight he was not prepared to carry. But events had their own momentum, and Tir found himself drawn into the Liberation Army despite his reservations. They needed help with missions that required someone bearing a true rune's power. Odessa asked, and Tir found it difficult to refuse someone whose conviction burned so brightly, whose belief in a better future seemed absolute. He agreed to help with small operations, telling himself he was not really joining the rebellion, just assisting with specific tasks while he figured out what to do long term. But each mission drew him deeper into the movement. Each success committed him more thoroughly to the cause. Each bond he formed with fellow rebels made it harder to imagine walking away. The early operations were carefully chosen to build momentum without overcommitting their limited resources. They raided an Imperial weapons convoy, distributing the captured arms to villages that could use them to defend against bandits the Empire had long since stopped protecting them from. They liberated political prisoners from a garrison that was using them as slave labor. They gathered intelligence about troop movements and supply lines, building a picture of the Empire's military disposition that would prove invaluable in future campaigns. Each mission succeeded, and each success attracted more people to the Liberation Army, refugees from Imperial persecution, soldiers disillusioned with the Empire's corruption, civilians who had simply had enough of exploitation and wanted to fight back. Tyre began to understand what the Soul Eater could do, the terrible scope of its power, and the price demanded for using it. The rune granted him abilities that went far beyond simple combat magic. He could consume the souls of enemies he killed, converting their spiritual essence into magical energy that enhanced his own capabilities. He could sense death approaching, feel the lives around him like candle flames that the rune wanted to extinguish. And worst of all, he could feel the rune manipulating fate itself, creating circumstances where people close to him would die, feeding itself on the lives of those he cared about. The knowledge that everyone he formed bonds with was condemned to feed the Soul Eater's hunger weighed on him constantly. He tried to keep people at emotional distance, tried to avoid caring too much about anyone, but found it impossible to maintain those barriers when fighting alongside people who trusted him with their lives. The Liberation Army's growth attracted Imperial attention. What had begun as a minor nuisance, a handful of rebels harassing supply lines and freeing prisoners, was becoming a genuine threat to Imperial authority in the northern provinces. Windy recognized Tir's involvement, understood that the young man who had escaped with the Soul Eater was now leading revolutionary forces against the Empire. She pushed Emperor Barbarossa to authorize military action against the rebels, to crush them before they grew strong enough to pose a real challenge to Imperial power. Barbarossa, indifferent to the details, agreed to whatever Windy suggested, signing orders for military campaigns without reading them, allowing his court magician to effectively rule through his authority. The Empire deployed forces under General Quanda Rosman, the Iron Wall, whose defensive strategies had never been breached, and whose loyalty to the Empire was absolute. Quanda established fortified positions throughout the northern territories, creating strongpoints that would be nearly impossible to assault directly, designed to contain the Liberation Army and gradually strangle their supply lines until they were forced to either surrender or starve. It was a sound strategy that played to Quanda's strengths, avoiding the kind of mobile warfare where rebels could use their knowledge of local terrain to offset the Empire's numerical superiority. But the Liberation Army had advantages the Empire did not fully appreciate. They had Odessa's strategic brilliance, allowing them to anticipate Imperial moves and position themselves to exploit weaknesses before those weaknesses became obvious. They had local support, villagers who provided intelligence about Imperial movements and shelter when rebels needed to disappear. They had moral authority, fighting for their homes and families rather than for an abstract concept of imperial power. And they had Tir, whose Soul Eater granted him combat capabilities that made him dangerous enough that the Empire had to commit significant resources just to counter his presence on the battlefield. The conflict escalated through a series of engagements that gradually shifted the balance. The Liberation Army could not face Imperial forces in open battle, lacked the numbers and equipment for that kind of direct confrontation. But they could raid, harass, disrupt, make holding territory so expensive that the Empire bled resources trying to maintain control. They struck supply convoys, forcing the Empire to dedicate more troops to escort duty. They ambushed patrol units, making Imperial soldiers afraid to venture far from their fortified positions. They inspired villages to resist Imperial tax collectors, creating administrative chaos that multiplied beyond what simple military action could achieve. Through all of this, Odessa remained the heart of the movement, the reason people believed resistance was possible. She visited villages that were considering supporting the Liberation Army, speaking to crowds with passion and conviction, explaining her vision of a nation that served its people rather than exploiting them. She personally led many of the early missions, refusing to ask her followers to risk what she would not risk herself, earning respect through shared danger rather than demanding it through rank. She was beloved by those who followed her, seen as the embodiment of everything the rebellion stood for, the hope that a better world was possible if they were willing to fight for it. Then, during a raid on an Imperial fortress, everything changed. The mission had gone well initially, the Liberation Army's forces overwhelming the garrison and capturing valuable supplies. But as they were withdrawing, Imperial reinforcements arrived, cutting off their planned escape route. Odessa led a desperate rearguard action, holding position to allow the majority of her forces to escape through an alternate route, putting herself in maximum danger to save those who followed her. She was wounded during the fighting, an arrow or blade finding its mark, injury severe enough that she could not move quickly on her own. Victor and others fought their way back to her position, refusing to leave her behind, determined to extract their leader even if it cost them their own lives. They succeeded in reaching her, in carrying her back to the mountain hideout, in bringing her to their limited medical facilities where Eileen, their healer, could try to treat her wounds. But the injury was too severe, the damage too extensive, or perhaps the Soul Eater was already manipulating fate to claim someone Tir had come to care about. Odessa lingered for hours, conscious and aware of what was happening, using her remaining time to speak with those who had followed her, to pass on her vision and her hope that they would continue the fight even after she was gone. She called Tir to her side in her final hours. She could see that he blamed himself, saw in his eyes the belief that his presence had brought about her death, that the Soul Eater had claimed her to feed its hunger. She told him this was not his fault, that she had chosen to fight knowing the risks, that death in pursuit of justice was preferable to living under tyranny without resistance. She asked him to take up leadership of the Liberation Army after she died, to continue the revolution she had started, to see it through to victory or to honorable defeat, but not to allow it to simply collapse because she was no longer there to guide it. She saw in him the potential to become more than he believed himself capable of being, saw that the young man who had reluctantly joined their cause could become the leader they would need to face what was coming. Odessa died as dawn broke over the mountain hideout, her last words urging those around her to carry on, to remember why they fought, to never surrender to the despair that would say their cause was hopeless. Her death hit the Liberation Army like a physical blow. She had been more than their leader, More than the strategic mind directing their operations, she had been their symbol, their inspiration, the living proof that nobility and idealism could coexist with practical action. Without her, many felt lost, uncertain whether they could continue the fight, or whether Odessa's death meant the rebellion was doomed to fail. Tir carried the weight of her death in ways others could not fully understand. The Soul Eater had claimed someone he cared about, exactly as Ted had warned it would, exactly as the curse promised. Odessa had died because of him, because the rune needed to feed, because fate itself bent around him to create the circumstances of her death. He wanted to leave, to abandon the Liberation Army and disappear before the Soul Eater could claim anyone else. But Victor, Flick, Humphrey, and the others would not let him retreat into isolation. They needed him now more than ever. Odessa had asked him to lead, and they were asking him to honor that final request, to become what she had seen in him even if he could not yet see it in himself. Into this crisis stepped Matthew Silverberg, Odessa's uncle, a man whose reputation as a strategist rivaled even Leon Silverberg's legendary status. Matthew had been living in self-imposed exile, disgusted by the Empire's corruption and his own family's complicity in enabling it. He had retired from public life, retreating to remote territories where he tried to forget about politics and warfare and the responsibility that came with his considerable abilities. But news of his niece's death brought him out of retirement. Odessa had been family, had embodied everything Matthew had once believed about duty and service before cynicism and disappointment drove him into isolation. Her death demanded response, required that he return to the world he had abandoned and use his gifts to complete the work she had started. Matthew arrived at the mountain hideout and offered his services to the Liberation Army, but only on condition that they acknowledge what they truly were. They were no longer a band of rebels harassing the Empire's edges. They were an army that sought to overthrow the government and replace it with something better. That required structure, organization, centralized command, all the things that romantic revolutionaries often rejected, but that actual revolutions required to succeed. And it required a leader, someone who would serve as focal point for their cause, symbol around which they could unite, commander whose authority was absolute enough to make the difficult decisions that warfare demands. He offered that position to Tir. Not because Tir was the most experienced, the most skilled, or the most qualified by traditional measures, but because Tir bore the Soul Eater, one of the 27 true runes, marking him as significant in ways that transcended normal hierarchies. Because Odessa had chosen him as her successor, her final words endorsing his leadership. Because people were already following him, already looking to him for guidance, even if he had not formally accepted command. And most importantly, because Matthew had observed him carefully and recognized in him qualities that made for genuine leadership rather than mere authority. Tir did not seek power for its own sake. He fought because he could not do otherwise, because his conscience would not allow him to look away from suffering when he possessed the power to alleviate it. That kind of moral clarity, combined with the Soul Eater's power and Odessa's endorsement, could become the foundation for something strong enough to challenge the Scarlet Moon Empire. Tir accepted, not because he wanted to lead, but because refusing felt like betraying Odessa's faith in him. He became the leader of the Liberation Army, the young man around whom the rebellion would now center. Matthew became his chief strategist, the tactical mind that would transform individual victories into sustained campaign. that would guide Tir through the complexities of warfare and politics that his training had not prepared him for. Together, they would need to build on what Odessa had started, expanding the Liberation Army from a regional nuisance into a force capable of toppling an empire. The first task was establishing a proper headquarters. The mountain hideout had served well enough when they were a small band of rebels, but an army required space, facilities, infrastructure that the cramped fortress could not provide. Matthew identified Toran Castle, an ancient fortress on an island in Lake Toran, abandoned years ago after falling into disrepair, forgotten by imperial authorities because it seemed to have no strategic value. But Matthew saw what others missed. The castle's island location made it defensible. Its size could accommodate a growing army. Its position on Lake Toran gave access to water routes that could facilitate supply and communication. With work, Toran Castle could become the seat of power for a new nation being born from revolution. The Liberation Army moved to Toran Castle, transforming the decrepit fortress into a functioning headquarters. Hundreds of people labored to restore what had fallen into ruin, rebuilding walls, clearing debris, establishing facilities for military operations and civilian administration. The castle became more than just a military base. It became a city, a community, a statement that the Liberation Army was building something permanent rather than simply destroying what existed. Refugees from imperial oppression arrived daily, seeking protection and opportunity to contribute to the cause. Merchants set up shops within the castle walls, providing goods and services that an army required. Craftsmen established workshops, producing weapons, armor, supplies. The castle lived and breathed with the energy of people who believed they were creating something better than what they had left behind. Central to everything happening at Toran Castle was the gathering of the 108 Stars of Destiny. Matthew understood their significance, had studied the ancient texts and prophecies that described how these stellar spirits appeared during times of great upheaval, seeking bearers who would unite to change the course of history. The stars were not consciously sought out, but rather found naturally, drawn to the Liberation Army by forces beyond any individual's control or understanding. Each person who joined the army bearing one of these stellar marks added their unique capabilities and perspectives, contributing to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. Some stars were warriors like Pan, Gremio, and Cleo, who had followed Tir from the McDohl household and now served as his primary retinue. Others were strategists like Matthew and Apple, who recorded everything to ensure accurate history would survive regardless of who won the war. There were craftsmen like Kimberly and Mars, who improved the army's equipment and facilities. Healers like Eileen and Lucan, who tended the wounded and sick. Merchants like Leiden and Jean, who managed trade and procurement. Entertainers like Gaspar and Esmeralda, who maintained morale through performances that reminded people why they fought. Each star filled a specific role, their combined presence creating something that felt almost magical in its coordination and effectiveness. The process of gathering the stars sometimes required going out into the world to find specific individuals whose talents were needed. Tir travelled extensively through territories both rebel-controlled and still under imperial authority, searching for people marked by destiny, convincing them to join the Liberation Army's cause. These journeys took him to diverse regions of the empire. To Ante, where corruption had reached levels that made even imperial loyalists question their allegiance. To Kaku, where a village struggled against bandits without any imperial assistance. To Banner Village, where ethnic tensions threatened to erupt into violence that would serve no one's interests. Each recruitment brought not just a new member, but a new story, a new perspective on the Empire's failure and the Liberation Army's promise. Kirkis, a young elf who believed his people had been betrayed by human allies, brought with him the potential for alliance with the elves of the Great Forest. Lepant, a wealthy noble whose wife had been kidnapped by bandits while Imperial forces did nothing, contributed resources and legitimacy that made the rebellion appear less like desperate rabble and more like serious alternative government. Kasumi, a ninja serving the Rokaku clan, provided intelligence-gathering capabilities that allowed the Liberation Army to anticipate Imperial moves. Valeria, a Knight of Honor betrayed by the Empire she had served, brought not just her considerable combat skills, but proof that even the Empire's elite were losing faith in its leadership. The recruitment of certain stars required completing quests or resolving conflicts that tested Tir's judgment and capabilities. To recruit Lepant, Tir had to rescue his wife Eileen from bandits at Panu Yakuta Fortress, demonstrating the Liberation Army's commitment to protecting civilians even when no immediate strategic advantage was gained. To bring Kirkis and the elves into the alliance, Tir had to mediate between humans and elves in Kuan, solving a murder mystery that threatened to reignite ancient prejudices and showing that justice could be pursued through investigation and evidence, rather than assumptions and bigotry. To gain Taiho and Yamku, riverboat operators whose knowledge of Lake Toran's waters would prove invaluable, Tir had to win a game of Chinchirorin, proving that leadership sometimes meant accepting challenges in arenas far removed from battlefield courage. As the Liberation Army grew stronger and the stars gathered at Toran Castle, the Empire began taking them seriously as a threat. Windy pushed for increasingly aggressive military responses, demanding that Barbarossa commit the Empire's full might to crushing the rebellion before it grew strong enough to truly challenge imperial authority. But the Emperor's apathy meant that imperial responses, while significant, were never quite overwhelming enough to destroy the Liberation Army in a single decisive campaign. The Empire would commit forces sufficient to cause serious problems, but not enough to guarantee victory, allowing the rebellion to survive, learn from each encounter, and grow stronger through adaptation. The first major imperial offensive came under General Kwanda Rosman, whose Iron Wall strategy had contained the Liberation Army during its early days. But Kwanda's defensive approach, while excellent for protecting imperial territory, was less effective when the Empire needed offensive action to destroy rebel strongholds. Mathieu analyzed Kwanda's tactics and identified vulnerabilities in the overextended supply lines required to sustain fortified positions so far from Gregminster. The Liberation Army launched coordinated strikes against those supply lines, forcing Kwanda to either withdraw his forward positions or watch his troops starve in their fortresses. Kwanda chose to hold position, believing that his defensive works were strong enough to endure temporary supply disruptions. It was a reasonable calculation based on his previous experience, but it did not account for how thoroughly the Liberation Army had rallied local populations to their cause. Villages that the Empire assumed would remain neutral or even supportive, instead actively sabotaged imperial supply efforts, ambushed convoys, provided intelligence to the rebels. Kwanda found himself commanding increasingly desperate troops in fortresses that became prisons, his legendary defensive skills irrelevant when his soldiers could not be fed or reinforced. The siege of Kwanda's fortresses became a turning point. Imperial soldiers, facing starvation while watching Liberation Army forces grow stronger around them, began deserting in significant numbers. Some fled back toward Gregminster, abandoning their post to save themselves. others defected to the Liberation Army, deciding that the rebellion offered better prospects than dying slowly in a fortress, while their emperor ignored their plight. Quanda himself, the Iron Wall, whose defenses had never been breached, was forced to surrender his remaining forces after Mathieu offered terms that guaranteed the safety of Imperial soldiers who laid down their arms. The Liberation Army's policy of clemency toward defeated Imperial soldiers proved strategically brilliant, where mass executions or harsh treatment would have stiffened Imperial resistance, making soldiers fight to the death rather than face certain doom after surrender. The promise of fair treatment encouraged defection and made Imperial soldiers question why they were fighting for an empire that treated them as expendable. Some captured soldiers chose to join the Liberation Army after witnessing how the rebels treated prisoners with dignity, providing food and medical care, allowing those who wished to return home to do so without reprisal. Others simply went home, tired of fighting for causes they did not understand or believe in, but they spread word throughout the empire that the Liberation Army was not the bloodthirsty terrorist organization that Imperial propaganda portrayed. Each victory expanded the territory under Liberation Army control and attracted more supporters to the cause. Villages that had been afraid to openly support the rebellion now felt safe enough to declare their allegiance. Nobles who had privately sympathized with the Liberation Army's goals while publicly maintaining loyalty to the empire began offering discreet assistance and information. Imperial officials whose consciences troubled them about the corruption they witnessed provided intelligence about troop movements and strategic plans. The rebellion was achieving critical mass, becoming something that could no longer be dismissed as a regional disturbance, but had to be recognized as an existential threat to the empire itself. But the Liberation Army also suffered losses that reminded everyone of the terrible cost of revolution. Not every mission succeeded. Not every battle ended in victory. Imperial forces sometimes ambushed rebel units, killing or capturing fighters the Liberation Army could not afford to lose. Villages that declared for the rebellion found themselves targeted by Imperial punitive expeditions, burned as examples to discourage others from following their lead. And always, the Soul Eater exacted its price, claiming the lives of people Tir had come to care about, feeding on the bonds he formed despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance. The deaths weighed on Tir in ways that command losses did not burden Mathieu or the other strategists. Every person who died fighting for the Liberation Army was someone Tir felt personally responsible for, someone whose fate might have been different if he had made better decisions, fought more effectively, been the leader they deserved rather than the reluctant commander thrust into position by circumstance and destiny. The Soul Eater amplified this guilt, its curse ensuring that those closest to him faced the greatest danger, that his affection for specific individuals marked them for death as surely as any Imperial hit list could. Gremio felt this weight most heavily, though not from any curse or supernatural influence. He had served the McDohl family since before Tir was born, had raised the young master with more parental devotion than most actual parents provided, had followed him from Gregminster to the mountain hideout to Toran Castle, through every danger and every victory. Gremio was Tir's oldest companion, the one constant presence through all the changes and upheavals. His loyalty was absolute, his affection genuine, his willingness to sacrifice for Tir's sake beyond question, which made him, in the terrible logic of the Soul Eater's curse, one of the people most at risk. The crisis came during the Liberation Army's assault on Sonnier Prison, a fortress where the Empire held political prisoners and anyone else deemed too dangerous or inconvenient to allow freedom. Intelligence suggested that several individuals important to the Liberation Army's cause were imprisoned there, including people who bore stars of destiny and could significantly strengthen the army if recruited. Matthew planned a raid to liberate the prisoners before the Empire decided to execute them, rather than risk their rescue. The mission went wrong from the start. Imperial forces were waiting for them, having been tipped off about the raid, or perhaps having laid a trap using the prisoners as bait. The Liberation Army forces fought their way into the prison, but found themselves surrounded, escape routes cut off, Imperial reinforcements closing in from multiple directions. The facility itself harbored another danger that had been deliberately introduced or perhaps inadvertently cultivated: man-eating spores, a biological horror created by Necklord's vampiric experiments, organisms that consume living flesh and spread with terrifying speed when disturbed. As the Liberation Army attempted to retreat, someone triggered the spore's containment, whether through accident or deliberate sabotage. The organisms burst forth, filling corridors with deadly clouds, blocking escape routes, threatening to consume everyone in the facility, regardless of which side they fought for. The Imperials retreated, sealing sections of the prison to contain the outbreak, leaving the Liberation Army forces trapped with the spreading spores and rapidly diminishing time before the entire facility became a tomb. Gremio saw what was happening and understood what had to be done. Someone had to hold back the spores long enough for the others to escape, had to sacrifice themselves as a living barrier between the deadly organisms and the fleeing soldiers. He made the decision without consulting Tir or anyone else, positioning himself at a critical choke point, the doorway through which the spores were spreading toward where the main Liberation Army group was retreating. He told Tir to run, to escape, to survive and continue the fight. Then he turned to face the approaching spores, one man against a biological nightmare, buying time with his life, paying the price that allowed his young master to escape. The image that followed would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Gremio standing alone at the doorway, facing the spreading cloud of man-eating spores, his body becoming the barrier that held them back. The spores enveloped him, consuming flesh, but he remained standing through sheer will, holding position long enough for Tir and the others to reach safety. The doorway began to collapse, whether from structural damage during the fighting or from the spore's corrosive effect on the facility's supports. The last glimpse anyone had of Gremio was his silhouette against the spreading biological nightmare, still holding his position, still buying seconds with his life. As stone and timber fell to seal the passage and crush everything beneath, Tir tried to turn back, tried to reach Gremio, to save him, or at least die beside him, rather than allow him to sacrifice alone. But Pan and Cleo physically restrained him, dragged him away despite his struggles, knowing that allowing Tir to go back would make Gremio's sacrifice meaningless. They escaped Sonier prison with some of the prisoners they had come to liberate, technically achieving their mission objective. But the cost was devastating. Gremio, who had been there from the beginning, who had followed Tir into revolution without hesitation, who had loved his young master with devotion that exceeded duty, was gone, consumed by the man-eating spores while holding position so others could escape. The Liberation Army returned to Toran Castle with victory that felt like defeat. They had rescued the prisoners, struck a blow against Imperial authority, demonstrated that even the Empire's secure facilities were vulnerable. But Tir could not celebrate any of it. He retreated into himself, consumed by grief and guilt. The weight of command demanded he continue leading, but the personal cost of that command had just been measured in the life of the man who had raised him. For days after Saunière prison, Tir barely spoke. He attended strategy meetings but contributed nothing, stared at maps without seeing them, signed orders without reading them. The Soul Eater's mark seemed darker on his hand, pulsing with power fed by Gremio's sacrifice, mocking him with the strength gained from his servant's death. The other commanders tried to reach him, to pull him out of the spiral of guilt and grief, but words could not touch the place where his pain lived. He had known intellectually that the Soul Eater would claim those close to him, but knowing abstractly and experiencing the reality were entirely different things. Gremio was gone, and nothing would bring him back, and the weight of that permanence threatened to crush Tir completely. Victor finally broke through Tir's isolation with characteristic bluntness. They were drinking together, Victor forcing alcohol into Tir's hands and refusing to leave until the younger man engaged with reality rather than retreating into grief. Victor spoke of his own losses, the people he had cared about who died in previous wars, the guilt that never fully disappeared but could be channeled into determination to honor their sacrifices through continued fighting. Gremio had chosen his sacrifice, Victor explained, had made a conscious decision to trade his life for Tir's and for the Liberation Army's survival. To allow that sacrifice to destroy Tir, to abandon the cause Gremio died protecting, would be the real betrayal of his memory. The only way to honor Gremio was to continue, to fight harder, to build the better world that made his death mean something. The words reached Tir, not because they erased his guilt, but because they gave him a framework for living with it. He could not bring Gremio back. He could not change what the Soul Eater had done, but he could ensure that Gremio's sacrifice contributed to overthrowing the empire that had created conditions where such sacrifices became necessary. He could fight and win and build something better from the ruins of what was. It would not be enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. A path forward through grief toward purpose. Tir emerged from his isolation with renewed determination, throwing himself into the war with an intensity that concerned those who cared about him. He led more missions personally, taking greater risks, pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. Some whispered that he was courting death, seeking to join Gremio rather than live with the guilt of surviving. But Mathieu understood what was actually happening. Tir was learning to weaponize his pain, to transform grief into fuel for the fight against the Empire. It was not healthy, not sustainable over the long term, but it served the immediate purpose of keeping him functional and focused on the war that had to be won. The Liberation Army's momentum continued despite Gremio's loss, or perhaps accelerated because of it, as if his sacrifice had consecrated their cause and marked them as truly committed to victory regardless of cost. More stars gathered at Toran Castle, drawn by the growing legend of the rebellion and by the mysterious forces that governed their convergence. The castle expanded constantly. New wings added to accommodate new arrivals. Facilities multiplied to serve the needs of what was becoming not just an army, but a functioning state apparatus capable of administering liberated territories. Among the stars who arrived during this period was Lepan's son Giovanna, followed by her mother Eileen, who had been rescued from bandits during an earlier mission. There was Kirkis, representing the alliance with the elves of the Great Forest, bringing with him Sylvina and other members of his tribe. Kasumi arrived from Rokaku, accompanied by Kaga, expanding the Liberation Army's intelligence network. Lorelei and Ike contributed medical expertise that dramatically improved survival rates among wounded fighters. Kimberly enhanced their blacksmithing capabilities, allowing them to maintain and improve equipment at levels approaching Imperial standard. Each new arrival added unique capabilities that made the Liberation Army more capable, more resilient, more able to challenge the Empire on equal terms. The gathering of the stars was not just practical, but symbolic. Ancient prophecies spoke of the 108 stars of destiny gathering in times of great upheaval, their convergence allowing them to challenge fate itself, to reshape history according to their collective will. Mathieu recognized the pattern, understood that they were witnessing something that transcended normal military or political movements. This was destiny manifesting in tangible form, the universe arranging pieces on a cosmic chessboard for a confrontation that would determine the region's future for generations. The Empire, meanwhile, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of sustained rebellion and its own internal corruption. Provinces that had accepted imperial authority for centuries began questioning whether that authority remained legitimate when the government could not or would not address the problems that plagued them. Tax collectors found themselves unable to extract payments from populations that saw the Liberation Army as offering better prospects than continued imperial loyalty. Imperial garrisons discovered that the locals they were supposed to be protecting viewed them as occupiers rather than defenders. The social contract between empire and subjects was breaking down, eroded by decades of corruption that Barbarossa's apathy had allowed to flourish unchecked. General Tir McDohl found himself in an impossible position. He was Tir's father, loved his son despite the political distance now separating them, wanted to believe that the young man leading the Liberation Army was fighting for just causes. But Tir was also the Empire's most successful general, the ever victorious, whose loyalty had been rewarded with position and authority, whose entire identity was bound up in service to the Scarlet Moon Empire. How could he reconcile these irreconcilable loyalties? How could he fight against his own son, knowing that military victory would mean killing or capturing Tir? How could he refuse imperial commands without betraying everything he had built his life around? Tir tried to avoid direct confrontation, accepting assignments that kept him away from the main theaters of the Liberation Army's operations. But eventually, inevitably, the Empire commanded him to lead forces against the rebellion his son commanded. Windy, recognizing Tir's conflict and seeing opportunity in it, personally delivered the orders to crush the Liberation Army, making clear that refusal would be treated as treason, that consequences would follow if he did not fulfill his duty to the Empire. Tir found himself trapped between impossible choices, each path leading to betrayal of something fundamental to who he was. The confrontation between father and son came at Moravia Castle, a strategic fortress controlling access to territories the Liberation Army needed to secure before advancing on Gregminster. Tir commanded the Imperial forces defending Moravia, bringing his full tactical brilliance to bear, determined that if he must fight his son, he would do so with the full measure of his ability, rather than insult both of them with half-hearted resistance. Tir led the Liberation Army's assault, understanding that his father would show no mercy, that filial bonds would not translate into battlefield advantage, that this would be a genuine test of strength and strategy, where only the better prepared force would prevail. The battle raged for hours, both sides demonstrating the kind of discipline and tactical sophistication that came from being led by exceptional commanders. Tir's defensive positions were masterfully designed, his troops well trained and motivated by loyalty to their legendary general. The Liberation Army's assault was relentless, Mathieu's strategies probing for weaknesses, while Tir's personal combat prowess and the Soul Eater's power created breaches in defenses that should have held. The castle walls became the focal point, where two visions of the future collided, where a father who represented the old order faced a son who embodied revolutionary change. The assault on Moravia Castle eventually succeeded through a combination of Mathieu's strategic brilliance and the personal heroism of stars like Victor, Flick, and Humphrey, whose combat skills carved paths through Imperial formations that should have been impenetrable. Tir himself led the final push against the keep, the Soul Eater blazing with power as he fought his way toward where his father made his final stand. The confrontation between Tir and Teo was brief but intense. They fought with all the skill and determination that defined them both, but the Soul Eater's power ultimately proved decisive. When Tir's blade finally struck true, when the ever-victorious general fell defeated for the first time in his career, Teo's last words were not of regret, but of pride that his son had grown strong enough to defeat him, that the boy he had raised was proving capable of the great things destiny apparently had in store for him. Tir McDohl died in his son's arms, asking Tir to forgive him for the choices that had led them to this moment, asking him to understand that sometimes honor demanded paths that led away from those we loved. Tir held his father as life left him, adding another name to the list of people the Soul Eater had claimed, another weight to the guilt he carried for surviving when those around him did not. The victory at Moravia Castle secured crucial territory for the Liberation Army, opened the path toward Gregminster, demonstrated that even the Empire's greatest generals could be defeated, but the cost was personal in ways that no strategic assessment could quantify. Tir had killed his father. That fact would live with him forever, regardless of whether the cause had been just or the outcome necessary. The Liberation Army absorbed the victory and the grief, incorporating both into their ongoing transformation from rebel movement into legitimate alternative government. Word of Tir McDohl's defeat spread throughout the Empire, shocking those who had believed the ever-victorious truly invincible, inspiring those who had doubted whether the Liberation Army could actually challenge the Empire's military might. Imperial morale wavered as soldiers questioned whether fighting for Barbarossa's corrupt regime was worth dying for when even legendary generals could not guarantee victory. Desertions increased. Entire garrison units declared for the Liberation Army without fighting. The psychological impact of Teo's death was perhaps greater than any purely military consequence. In Gregminster, Windy recognized that the situation had reached a critical juncture. The Liberation Army was no longer a provincial rebellion that could be contained through measured military response. They were an existential threat to the Empire, an organized force capable of defeating the Empire's best commanders, commanding popular support that made them seem more legitimate than the government they opposed. If they were not stopped immediately, decisively, they would march on Gregminster itself and attempt to topple Barbarossa from his throne. Windy had to take direct action, had to use her own considerable power to destroy the Liberation Army before they grew strong enough to challenge even a true rune bearer. Windy's strategy involved leveraging her position as court magician to manipulate Imperial resources and personnel toward her goals. She began systematically removing potential obstacles, arranging accidents and scandals that eliminated officials who might oppose her increasingly direct control of Imperial policy. She activated spy networks to gather intelligence about the Liberation Army's capabilities and plans. She summoned creatures from other dimensions, building an army of monsters that would supplement Imperial forces in the coming confrontation. And she plotted how to neutralize Tir's Soul Eater, recognizing that the Liberation Army's greatest asset was also their most obvious vulnerability if she could figure out how to counter or corrupt it. The Liberation Army, meanwhile, continued gathering the stars of destiny with increasing urgency. Mathieu understood that according to the ancient prophecies, only when all 108 stars were gathered would they possess the power necessary to challenge true rune bearers like Windy. Each star recruited brought them closer to that threshold, closer to the point where cosmic forces would tip in their favor and allow them to achieve what should have been impossible. The search for remaining stars became a priority equal to military operations. Teams dispatched to distant corners of the Empire seeking individuals marked by destiny. Some stars required heroic effort to recruit, their situations desperate or their allegiances complicated by personal circumstances. Futch, a young dragon rider, initially opposed the Liberation Army because Imperial propaganda had convinced him they were terrorists who killed innocents. Only after witnessing Imperial atrocities firsthand and being saved by Liberation Army forces did he recognize where true justice lay. Peshmerga, a mysterious warrior pursuing a private vendetta against a demon, joined the cause only after that demon's connection to Windy was revealed, making the Liberation Army's fight against the Empire align with his personal quest. Clive, a gunslinger tracking a target across the Empire, was recruited only after his target led him to Toran Castle, and Tir convinced him that vengeance could wait until after the Empire was reformed to prevent the kinds of injustices that had set Clive on his path. The castle's expansion accelerated to accommodate the growing population. New wings added almost weekly. Facilities multiplied to serve the diverse needs of what was becoming not just military headquarters, but functioning capital of a nation being born from revolution. There was a library where scholars preserved knowledge and planned for education systems that would serve liberated territories. A theatre where entertainers maintained morale and reminded people of the cultural heritage they were fighting to preserve. A garden where Tir could occasionally find moments of peace away from command decisions and battlefield stress. A war room where Mathieu and other strategists planned campaigns that would determine whether revolution succeeded or failed. A council chamber where representatives from liberated territories gathered to discuss governance and policy, building the administrative structures that would be needed when military victory was achieved. The diversity of the stars illustrated the breadth of the coalition Tir was building. There were humans, elves, and dwarves, each bringing their own cultural perspectives and capabilities. There were warriors and scholars, merchants and craftsmen, young and old, cynical and idealistic. Some joined because they believed passionately in the Liberation Army's cause. Others joined because they had nowhere else to go. Refugees from imperial persecution who found sanctuary at Toran Castle. Still others came seeking redemption for past failures or mistakes, hoping that contributing to revolution might balance karmic scales they believed tipped against them. Regardless of motivation, each added their strength to the collective. Each became part of something larger than themselves. As the 108 stars gradually assembled, people began noticing strange phenomena around Toran Castle. Coincidences became too consistent to be truly random. Supply shortages were resolved through unexpected discoveries or timely arrivals of merchant caravans. Imperial intelligence operations mysteriously failed at crucial moments. Weather patterns favored Liberation Army operations with suspicious regularity. Those familiar with the ancient prophecies recognized the signs. Destiny itself was beginning to manifest in tangible form, reality bending to support the gathered stars' collective cause. The universe was choosing sides, and it had apparently decided that the Scarlet Moon Empire's time had passed. that new leadership was required regardless of what individuals might prefer. The Sardir gathering of stars reached critical mass when Tir recruited the final few individuals necessary to complete the 108. Among the last to join was Lepont, the nobleman who had initially been reluctant to fully commit to revolution, but eventually recognized that the empire was beyond redemption through moderate reform. There was Warren, a strategist whose intelligence and tactical insights made him invaluable to Mathieu's planning efforts. Mose, a ninja whose stealth capabilities allowed the Liberation Army to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations behind Imperial lines. And finally, unexpectedly, Ted returned, drawn back to Tir's side by the Soul Eater's pull, and by his own desire to see the revolution succeed despite having passed the burden of the rune to someone else. When the final star was recruited, when all 108 bearers of destiny were gathered at Toran Castle, reality itself seemed to shift subtly. The ancient prophecy was complete. The stars of destiny had converged around a single leader at a moment of historic upheaval. Now the true test would begin, the confrontation between gathered destiny and entrenched power, between the righteous cause of liberation and the corrupt but still formidable might of an empire that had ruled the Toran region for over 2 centuries. Mathieu recognized that the moment had come for the final campaign, the march on Gregminster itself, to depose Barbarossa and establish a new government that would serve the people rather than exploiting them. The strategic situation favored the Liberation Army as much as it ever would. They controlled vast territories and had popular support throughout most of the empire. Imperial forces were demoralized and fragmented. Barbarossa's court was consumed by internal conflicts and conspiracies. If they struck now, hard and fast, they could take the capital before the empire organized effective resistance. But if they delayed, allowed the empire time to consolidate and counterattack, they risked losing momentum and facing a prolonged siege that would bleed both sides white. Tir authorized the final offensive, understanding that this decision committed them irrevocably to total victory or total defeat. They were beyond the point where negotiated settlement was possible. The empire would crush them utterly if given the chance, and the Liberation Army's only path forward led through Gregminster's gates to Barbarossa's throne. The war that had begun with a few rebels in the mountain hideout, that had grown through Odessa's inspiration and Mathieu's strategy and Tir's reluctant acceptance of leadership, would now reach its climax in the Empire's heart. The march on Gregminster was not a single battle, but a campaign, a series of engagements as the Liberation Army fought through the Imperial defenses that ringed the capital. Outlying fortresses were besieged and captured. Imperial armies sent to block the advance were defeated through combination of superior tactics and the supernatural advantages that 108 gathered stars provided. Local populations welcomed the Liberation Army as liberators, rather than resisting them as invaders, providing supplies and intelligence that made the advance significantly easier than pure military analysis would have predicted. But as they approached Gregminster proper, resistance stiffened dramatically. This was the Empire's last line of defense, the capital itself, and Imperial forces fought with the desperation of those who understood that defeat here meant the end of everything they had served. Windy had fortified the city extensively, summoning creatures from other dimensions to supplement Imperial soldiers, erecting magical barriers that made assault costly and difficult. The siege of Gregminster became the largest engagement of the entire war. Tens of thousands on each side locked in combat for control of the Empire's political and symbolic heart. Tir found himself confronted by his father's legacy in unexpected ways during the siege. Many Imperial soldiers who fought to defend Gregminster had served under Tir McDohl, had loved their legendary general, now fought with extra determination to honor his memory by preventing his son from accomplishing the revolution that had brought them into conflict. They did not hate Tir. Many even respected what he was fighting for, but they could not abandon their posts when doing so would shame Teo's memory. The ever-victorious general had died fighting for the Empire, and his soldiers would do no less. It created a strange dynamic, where both sides were in some sense fighting to honor Teo. Their competing interpretations of what that honor demanded, driving them to try to kill each other. The siege's turning point came when elements within Gregminster itself rose up to support the Liberation Army. The city's lower classes, who had suffered most from the Empire's corruption, saw the Liberation Army's approach as opportunity to settle scores with the nobles and officials who had exploited them for years. Riots broke out in the slums, drawing Imperial forces away from the walls to maintain internal order. Gates that should have remained sealed were opened by sympathizers who had infiltrated the garrison. Supply depots caught fire under mysterious circumstances that suggested sabotage rather than accident. The city began tearing itself apart from within, while the Liberation Army pressed their assault from without. Windy recognized that conventional defense was failing, that the combination of military pressure and internal rebellion was overwhelming Imperial capabilities. She made the decision to take direct action, to use her true rune fragment and her considerable magical abilities to personally confront the Liberation Army's leadership. If she could kill Tir and claim the Soul Eater, the rebellion would collapse regardless of how many stars of destiny they had gathered. Remove the focal point, and the revolution would fragment into competing factions that could be dealt with individually rather than facing them as unified force. The confrontation happened in the Palace District as Liberation Army forces fought through the outer defenses toward Barbarossa's throne room. Windy appeared before Tir and his personal retinue, accompanied by creatures summoned from dimensions where reality operated according to different rules, backed by Imperial elite guards who had been enhanced with magic that made them far more dangerous than ordinary soldiers. She demanded that Tir surrender the Soul Eater, claimed that it rightfully belonged to her as the one who had sought it for 3 centuries, argued that he was merely temporary custodian of power he had neither earned nor truly understood. Tir refused, understanding that whatever Windy wanted the Soul Eater for was certainly nothing good, that allowing her to claim another true rune would create a being of terrifying power, completely unconstrained by conscience or morality. The Soul Eater might be cursed, might condemn its bearer to watching everyone they cared about die, but at least Tir was trying to use its power toward just ends. Windy would use it purely for domination and destruction, amplifying her worst impulses the way the Soul Eater amplified the fatal attraction of doom around those its bearer loved. The battle that followed showcased the true power of true runes when wielded by serious combatants. Windy's gate rune opened portals to other dimensions, summoning forth horrors that should not exist in natural world, creatures whose very presence bent reality around them. The Soul Eater responded by consuming the souls of everything Tir killed, growing stronger with each death, feeding on mortality itself to enhance its bearer's capabilities. The palace around them became collateral damage, ancient stones shattered by magical energies, priceless artwork destroyed by misfired spells, the seat of imperial power torn apart by forces that cared nothing for historical or cultural significance. Tir could not have defeated Windy alone, even bearing the Soul Eater. Her experience with true rune magic far exceeded his, her ruthlessness unmatched by his moral constraints about acceptable costs. But he did not fight alone. The 108 stars of destiny had gathered for exactly this moment, their combined presence creating effects that transcended normal magical or military capabilities. Victor and Flick covered Tir's flanks, their legendary fighting skills keeping Windy's summons from overwhelming him. Matthew directed their movements from tactical position, anticipating Windy's strategies and countering them before they fully developed. Camendol and the other magicians among the stars combined their powers to disrupt Windy's spellcasting, creating interference that prevented her from bringing her full abilities to bear. And the sheer presence of destiny itself, concentrated in the gathered stars, seemed to tip probability in their favor, making unlikely successes more probable and her calculated tactics less effective than they should have been. The battle raged through multiple palace chambers, neither side able to gain decisive advantage, both pouring everything they had into the confrontation. Windy grew increasingly desperate as she realized that despite her power and experience, she was losing ground against the gathered stars' collective strength. She had planned for fighting a true rune bearer, had strategies for countering the Soul Eater's capabilities, but she had not fully accounted for what it meant when 108 fragments of cosmic destiny united behind that bearer, when fate itself became a weapon in the arsenal arrayed against her. In the final exchange, as both sides reached the limits of endurance, Tir struck a decisive blow. The Soul Eater consumed Windy's summoned creatures, draining the magical energy that sustained them, turning her own weapons against her by feeding on the dimensional portals she had opened. Her gate rune fragments shattered under the strain, unable to maintain the incredible power output she had demanded from it, breaking apart into useless crystalline fragments that dissolved into nothingness. Windy herself was thrown back by the backlash, her body unable to contain the energies that had been flowing through her, aging rapidly as the magical forces that had sustained her for centuries suddenly abandoned her. She collapsed, mortal and dying, her centuries-long quest for true runes ending in failure and dissolution. In her final moments, she spoke not of regret, but of frustration that she had come so close to achieving her goals, that the Soul Eater had been within her grasp multiple times only to slip away. She refused to explain what she had wanted the true runes for, what purpose drove her to such lengths, what vision motivated her 3-century-long campaign of manipulation and destruction. Those secrets died with her, leaving historians to speculate about motivations that would never be fully understood. With Windy defeated, the path to Barbarossa's throne room lay open. The remaining Imperial guards, seeing their court magician fall, lost whatever determination had kept them fighting. Some fled, others surrendered. A few died still trying to fulfill their duty to protect the Emperor, but their resistance was token at best, symbolic gestures rather than genuine military opposition. The Liberation Army fought through to the throne room, where Emperor Barbarossa awaited whatever judgment they intended to deliver. They found him sitting on his throne, wearing his golden armor, alone except for a handful of guards, who remained more from personal loyalty than because they believed they could actually protect him. Barbarossa looked old, far older than his actual years, worn down by decades of rule that had transformed from noble purpose to exhausted obligation. He did not try to flee or fight. He simply waited, accepting that his reign was over, that the empire he had once hoped to guide toward prosperity and justice had instead collapsed into corruption that spawned revolution. Tir entered the throne room with his companions, prepared for final confrontation with the Emperor, expecting to have to fight through guards or overcome magical defenses or face some last, desperate gambit. Instead, he found only an old man who looked relieved that the burden of rule was finally being lifted from his shoulders. Barbarossa acknowledged defeat, admitted that the Empire had failed its people under his leadership, recognized that the Liberation Army's grievances were justified even if he had been too consumed by grief and manipulation to address them, when intervention might have prevented catastrophe. But before Barbarossa could formally abdicate, before the transfer of power could happen through negotiation rather than violence, a crisis emerged that revealed the true depth of the Scarlet Moon Empire's problems. The Dragon King's sword, the legendary weapon that housed the Sovereign Rune and symbolized the Emperor's authority, suddenly activated of its own accord. The rune blazed with power, and from that power emerged a manifestation that had been building for years, feeding on the corruption and suffering that had defined Barbarossa's later reign. The Golden Hydra materialized, a massive creature born from the Sovereign Rune's corruption, its multiple heads representing the many failures of imperial governance, its golden scales mocking the title Barbarossa had earned through his initial victories. This was not an enemy from outside the Empire, but rather the Empire's own sins given physical form, the accumulated weight of decades of exploitation and neglect transformed through true rune magic into a monster that would destroy everything unless stopped. The Sovereign Rune, designed to grant authority and legitimacy to righteous rulers, had been slowly poisoned by Barbarossa's abandonment of his duties, his allowing Windy to manipulate imperial policy, his retreat into grief and apathy while his subjects suffered. Barbarossa understood what was happening, recognized that he bore responsibility for the Golden Hydra's manifestation. The Sovereign Rune was rejecting him, expelling the corruption that had built up during his compromised reign, attempting to cleanse itself, even if that cleansing destroyed the capital city in the process. He could feel the rune's judgment, its disappointment that he had failed to live up to the promise of his early reign, that he had allowed personal grief to override his duty to his people. This was his final failure, the ultimate price for his years of negligent rule. The Emperor made a decision. He removed the Dragon King's sword from its ceremonial place, gripping the weapon despite knowing what would follow. He told Tir to take whoever remained and flee, to escape, while he bought them time, to survive and build something better from the ruins of his failed empire. Then Barbarossa charged the Golden Hydra. Alone, the Emperor facing the monster his corruption had created, attempting through final sacrifice to achieve redemption that decades of passive rule had forfeited. The battle was brief and terrible. Barbarossa's skill with the blade remained formidable despite his years, his training from the War of Succession still evident in his movements. But the Golden Hydra was a manifestation of true rune power, a creature that could not be defeated through martial prowess alone. It tore through Barbarossa's golden armor, its multiple heads striking from angles impossible to defend against simultaneously, overwhelming the Emperor through sheer power and ferocity. Barbarossa fought until his strength failed, until his body could no longer respond to his will, until finally he fell, still gripping the Dragon King's sword, dead at the feet of the monster his failures had created. The Golden Hydra, having killed its creator, turned its attention to the Liberation Army forces in the throne room. This was a threat that transcended the political conflict between Empire and rebels. This was apocalyptic danger, a rampaging manifestation of true rune power that would destroy everything in its path until either it was stopped or Gregminster lay in ruins with its population dead or scattered. Tir and the gathered stars had no choice but to face it, to fight something that should have been beyond mortal capability to defeat, trusting that the destiny they represented would provide the edge needed to overcome impossible odds. The battle against the Golden Hydra tested everything the Liberation Army had learned and built over the months of revolution. Each of its heads had to be destroyed separately. Each required different tactics and capabilities to counter. Each represented a different aspect of the Empire's corruption. The stars combined their abilities in ways that created effects greater than the sum of individual contributions. Destiny itself channeled through their coordinated actions. Victor and Humphrey drew aggression from the Hydra's physical heads, tanking damage that would have killed lesser warriors. Mathieu and Lepont coordinated magical attacks that targeted the creature's mystical aspects. Apple and Sanchez provided tactical intelligence that allowed them to anticipate the Hydra's movements. Camandol and the other magicians disrupted the true rune energy that sustained the creature, gradually weakening it. And Tir, bearing the Soul Eater, struck at the Golden Hydra's core, the concentrated mass of corruption and suffering that animated the creature. The Soul Eater consumed the Hydra's essence, feeding on the accumulated death and misery that formed its substance, growing stronger with each piece of the creature it devoured. The battle was desperate, the outcome uncertain until the final moments. But ultimately, the gathered stars prevailed. The Golden Hydra dissolved, its component pieces scattering back into the raw magical energy from which they had been formed, leaving behind only the Dragon King's sword and Barbarossa's body. In the throne room's silence after the Hydra's defeat, Tir approached Barbarossa's corpse. The Emperor looked at peace, finally freed from the burden of rule that had crushed him. His face no longer carrying the weight of grief and guilt that had marked his later years. The Dragon King's sword lay beside him, its legendary blade no longer glowing with the sovereign rune's power. The rune itself had departed, freed from a bearer who had proven unworthy, seeking whatever fate true runes found when no suitable host existed for them. The empire Barbarossa had ruled was dead. The corruption that had consumed it lay defeated. What came next would be something new, built from revolution rather than inherited from collapsed legacy. The Liberation Army secured Gregminster over the following days, establishing order in a city that had nearly torn itself apart during the siege and the Golden Hydra's rampage. There was surprisingly little resistance. Most imperial officials and soldiers had lost faith in the government they served long before the capital fell, had been going through the motions of duty while privately hoping someone would end the farce and establish governance that actually functioned. The Liberation Army provided that alternative, and most people accepted it with relief rather than resentment. The transition from rebel movement to legitimate government required immediate attention to countless practical details. Food had to be distributed to a population that had endured siege conditions. Water systems damaged during the fighting had to be repaired. Security had to be established to prevent looting and violence from citizens settling personal scores. Communication had to be restored with outlying provinces to assure them that the revolution's success meant reform rather than chaos. Administration had to be organized to handle the mundane but essential tasks that any functioning government required. Mathieu, who had orchestrated the military campaign that toppled the empire, now turned his strategic brilliance to the challenge of building effective governance from revolutionary chaos. He established councils drawn from the gathered stars and representatives from liberated territories, ensuring that diverse perspectives informed policy decisions. He drafted legal codes that balanced justice with mercy, recognizing that too harsh an approach would simply create new resentments, while too lenient would allow old corruption to reassert itself. He organized taxation and resource distribution systems designed to fund necessary government functions without exploiting the population the way imperial tax collectors had. The work was unglamorous but essential, transforming idealistic vision into practical institutions that could actually serve people's needs. The question of what to call the new nation generated considerable debate. Some wanted to establish a new empire with Tir as emperor, believing that familiar structures would ease the transition and provide stability. Others argued for something completely different, a republic or confederation that formally rejected the imperial model and all it represented. Tir himself wanted no part of becoming emperor, having seen what that role had done to Barbarossa. Understanding that concentrating so much power in single individual inevitably corrupted regardless of initial intentions. After extended deliberation, they settled on a compromise. The Toran Republic, named for Lake Toran at the region's heart, governed through representative councils rather than imperial decree, with Tir serving as symbolic leader, but not autocratic ruler. The establishment of the Toran Republic provided closure for the war's political dimension, but it could not heal all the wounds the conflict had created or resurrect those who had died in its prosecution. The casualty count from 3 years of revolution and civil war was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides had died in battle. Countless civilians had been killed in sieges, caught in crossfires, executed by one side or another for providing support to their enemies. Entire villages had been destroyed, either burned by imperial punitive expeditions or devastated by revolutionary fervor. Families had been torn apart by divided loyalties, parents fighting children, siblings facing each other across battlefield lines. The price of overthrowing Barbarossa's corruption had been measured in blood and grief that would echo through generations. Among those counted as casualties was Gremio, whose sacrifice at Sonier prison haunted Tir in ways that victory and new government could not alleviate. The servant who had raised him, who had followed him into revolution without hesitation, who had died buying time for others to escape, remained dead, while Tir lived to see the world Gremio's sacrifice had helped create. The guilt of that survival weighed on Tir constantly, the Soul Eater's mark on his hand, a permanent reminder that his power came at the cost of those he cared about dying to feed the rune's hunger. But destiny, it seemed, had one more miracle to deliver. One final gift for the young man who had borne so much weight and paid such terrible prices to achieve revolution's success. A mysterious figure appeared at Toran Castle, a woman named Leknat, who bore the gate rune's other half, the counterpart to Windy's fragment, someone who understood true runes and their capabilities perhaps better than anyone else living. She had been watching the war from distance, observing how the 108 stars gathered, noting how Tir wielded the Soul Eater, assessing whether the revolution represented genuine improvement or merely exchanged one form of tyranny for another. She had concluded that Tir and the Liberation Army were worthy, that they represented hope for the future rather than simply continuation of past patterns under different names. And because of that assessment, because the gathered stars had achieved what the prophecies foretold, because Tir had proven himself capable of bearing terrible power without becoming corrupted by it, Leknat offered a gift that defied normal reality's constraints. She would use her true rune fragment and the concentrated destiny of the 108 stars to perform magic that should not be possible, to break rules that govern death and resurrection, to bring back someone who had been lost, Gremio returned from death, pulled back from whatever afterlife claimed those the Soul Eater consumed, restored to life through combination of Leknat's power and the gathered stars' collective destiny. He emerged confused and disoriented, uncertain how he had returned, the last moments at Saunier prison still fresh in his memory, even though months had passed. Tir embraced him with tears that released grief he had been carrying since that terrible day. Joy and disbelief mixed into something so powerful it transcended words. The impossible had happened. The curse had been, if not broken, at least temporarily overcome. Someone Tir cared about had been returned instead of taken away. Leknat explained that this resurrection was unique, a one-time event made possible only by the specific circumstances of the gathered stars and the revolution's success. She could not make it a habit, could not simply resurrect everyone who had died during the war. The magic required to break death's hold was immense, exhausting even for a true rune bearer, sustainable only when cosmic forces aligned in very specific ways. Gremio's return was gift and miracle, not precedent for future resurrections. Others who had fallen would remain fallen, their deaths permanent even though one had been reversed. But that single reversal mattered, proved that even the Soul Eater's curse was not absolutely inevitable. That hope remained possible even in darkest circumstances. The Toran Republic's first year was consumed by reconstruction and reconciliation, attempting to heal wounds that warfare had inflicted on the region. Former imperial territories had to be integrated into the new governmental structure, their populations persuaded that Republic offered better prospects than Empire had provided. Imperial officials who had not been egregiously corrupt were offered positions in the new administration, their experience valuable even though their previous allegiance had been to the defeated government. Soldiers from both sides of the conflict had to be reintegrated into civilian life, provided with resources and opportunities that would prevent them from becoming bandits or mercenaries, simply because they knew no other way to survive. The process was neither quick nor easy. Old resentments did not vanish, simply because new government proclaimed universal brotherhood. People who had lost family members to Liberation Army actions were not immediately ready to embrace their loved ones' killers as fellow citizens. Villages that had been burned by Imperial forces wanted vengeance even though the Empire no longer existed to be punished. Everywhere Tir looked, he saw wounds that governance alone could not heal, suffering that political solutions could not address, damage that would take generations to fully repair, if it could be repaired at all. The Soul Eater continued to mark Tir, its curse still active even after the war's end. He could feel it pulling at the lives around him, creating circumstances where those he cared about faced danger, manipulating fate to feed itself on death and grief. He had hoped that perhaps overthrowing the Empire would satisfy the rune. That achievement of his goal would let him rest. But true runes did not work that way. They were eternal, patient beyond human comprehension, pursuing purposes that transcended any individual conflict or achievement. The Soul Eater would continue claiming those Tir loved regardless of whether he led armies or lived in isolation, would feed on his emotional connections until either he died or transferred the rune to another bearer. Tir made the decision that Ted had made before him, and that Ted's grandfather had made before that. He could not remain in the Toran Republic, could not serve as its leader or even live among its people, because his presence endangered everyone around him. The Soul Eater would eventually claim Machu, Victor, Flick, Gremio again, anyone he allowed himself to care about. The only way to protect them was to leave, to take the curse away from everything he had fought to build and protect. It was not the ending he had hoped for, not the reward he had dreamed about during the darkest moments of the war, but it was the ending the Soul Eater's curse demanded, and he had learned through bitter experience that some burdens could not be set down through desire alone. Tir departed Toran Castle quietly, without ceremony or announcement, leaving only a letter explaining his decision to those who would wonder where he had gone. He took nothing with him except basic supplies and the clothes on his back. The Soul Eater's mark glowed against his hand, a constant reminder of the power and curse he carried. He walked away from everything he had built, from everyone he cared about, from the republic that existed because of his leadership, becoming a wanderer as Ted had been before him, moving through the world without settling anywhere, keeping distance from emotional connections, surviving while trying not to cause death to those around him. The Toran Republic continued without him, proving that the revolution's success did not depend on any single individual, that the institutions and principles they had established were strong enough to function even after their symbolic leader departed. Matthew continued serving as chief strategist and administrator, guiding policy with wisdom earned through decades of military and political experience. The 108 stars dispersed to various roles throughout the Republic, each contributing their unique capabilities to governance, commerce, security, culture. Some remained at Toran Castle, serving in official capacities. Others returned to homes and families, living the peaceful lives the war had been fought to make possible. Still others ventured into the wider world, seeking new adventures, or simply wanting to see what lay beyond the Toran region's borders. Victor and Flick resumed their mercenary partnership, taking contracts that aligned with their personal code, rather than serving any specific government or cause. They had fought in 2 wars now, the previous conflict between the Empire and rebels, then the Gate Rune War that finally ended Imperial rule. Both men were tired of large-scale warfare, wanted smaller engagements where success or failure affected dozens rather than thousands, where moral complexities could be navigated through personal judgment rather than obedience to strategic necessity. They would eventually become involved in other conflicts, drawn by their sense of honor and their inability to ignore injustice when they encountered it. But for now, they were content to operate on their own terms without answering to generals or councils. Gremio remained at Toran Castle, maintaining the chambers that had been Tir's, keeping everything ready for the young master's return, even though he knew intellectually that Tir would probably never come back. The servant could not simply abandon his post, could not accept that his role caring for the McDohl family heir had ended. So he waited, performing duties that no longer had object, finding purpose in preparing for a reunion that would likely never happen. Others found this dedication tragic or touching depending on their perspective. But Gremio did not care what others thought. He knew his duty, and that duty did not end simply because circumstances changed or the person he served had departed. Apple completed her chronicle of the Gate Rune War, producing the definitive historical account of the revolution that transformed the Scarlet Moon Empire into the Toran Republic. Her record would become the foundation for all future scholarship on the period. Praised for its accuracy and its refusal to romanticize either the Empire's corruption or the revolution's violence, she documented everything. The battles won and lost, the strategies successful and failed, the cost paid by both sides, the moral complexities that defied simple narratives of good versus evil. Future historians would build on her work, adding context and analysis, but none would match the immediacy and comprehension that came from having been present for the events themselves. Lepond returned to his mansion and his life as wealthy noble, but Forever changed by his experience with the Liberation Army, he used his resources to support the Republic's development, funding schools and hospitals, investing in infrastructure projects that connected remote regions to the new government services, providing opportunities for people whose potential had been wasted under the Empire's corrupt system. His wealth, which he had once enjoyed without much thought for how fortunate he was compared to those struggling in poverty, now became tool for building the more equitable society the revolution had promised. Kirkis returned to the Great Forest and his role as leader of the elves, carrying with him new understanding of how humans and elves could cooperate despite their differences. The alliance forged during the war created bonds that would persist for generations. Trade and cultural exchange, where previously there had been only mutual suspicion and occasional conflict. His experiences with the Liberation Army had shown him that humans were not all greedy exploiters who saw elves as inferior, that individuals could transcend the prejudices of their cultures when given reason to do so. Kasumi went back to serving the Rokaku clan, her skills sharper and her understanding deeper from her time with the Liberation Army. The ninja had learned that information gathering was not just about stealth and infiltration, but about understanding people, seeing the patterns in their behavior, recognizing what motivated them beyond simple surface appearances. She would apply these lessons in her clan service, becoming one of their most effective operatives precisely because she understood that successful intelligence work required empathy as much as technique. The years passed, the Toran Republic stabilizing and maturing, its initial revolutionary fervor gradually transforming into the steadier work of governance and administration. The generation that had fought in the Gate Rune War grew older, their stories becoming history, their sacrifices memorialized in monuments and ceremonies designed to ensure that future generations would remember the cost paid for their freedom. New challenges emerged that required attention and resources: border disputes with neighboring nations, economic disruptions as trade patterns adjusted to the new political reality, internal disagreements about policy and priorities that tested the Republic's commitment to representative government rather than autocratic decree. Tir wandered through these years, moving from region to region, never staying long enough to form the connections that would doom those around him to feed the Soul Eater's hunger. He heard occasional news of the Toran Republic, learned that it was functioning well without him, that his departure had not caused the collapse some had feared. The knowledge brought bittersweet satisfaction. He had succeeded in his goal of overthrowing the Empire and establishing better governance, but the cost was exile from everything he had fought to protect, permanent separation from everyone he cared about, endless wandering in service to a curse he had never asked to bear. Sometimes Tir encountered remnants of the old empire, officials who had fled rather than face justice, soldiers who refused to accept that the government they served had been defeated and replaced. These encounters rarely ended well for the Imperial holdouts. The Soul Eater had made Tir one of the most dangerous warriors alive, his combat capabilities enhanced by the rune's power to levels that few could match. He did not seek these confrontations, did not hunt down former enemies out of lingering resentment, but when they found him, when they forced conflict upon him, he defended himself with the full measure of power the true rune granted, leaving behind bodies that would feed the rune's hunger and reinforce his isolation. Occasionally, Tir would encounter others bearing true runes or fragments of them, fellow bearers of cosmic power who recognized him as kindred spirit bound by similar burdens. These meetings were always significant, two individuals marked by destiny, acknowledging each other across whatever circumstance brought them together. Sometimes they became temporary allies, cooperating to address shared threats. Other times, they became rivals or even enemies, their true runes conflicting natures making peaceful coexistence impossible. But always, these encounters reminded Tir that he was not unique in his suffering, that true runes scattered across the world, each imposing its own costs on whoever bore it, each shaping history through the lives of those it chose. 3 years after the Gate Rune War's end, Tir found himself in the Dunan region, north of Toran, observing from distance as a new conflict consumed that territory. The Highland Kingdom and the city-states of Jolston were locked in warfare that echoed the revolution Tir had led, another cycle of oppression and resistance, playing out with different names but similar patterns. He watched without intervening, recognizing that this was not his fight, that his presence would only complicate matters and potentially doom people to death through the Soul Eater's curse. But he observed the gathering of new stars of destiny around a young man bearing the Bright Shield rune, recognized the cosmic pattern repeating itself, understood that history moved in spirals rather than straight lines, each revolution creating conditions for the next. The hero of the Dunan Unification War, a young man whose name was lost to some records but whose deeds were recorded by the stars who gathered around him, would face challenges similar to those Tir had confronted. The burden of leadership thrust upon someone who never sought it. The weight of lives depending on decisions made without complete information or absolute certainty. The grief of watching comrades fall in pursuit of causes larger than individual survival. The corruption of power even, when wielded with best intentions. And the manipulation of true runes pursuing purposes that transcended mortal understanding or control. Tir did not know if the Dunan hero would succeed or fail, whether the Bright Shield and Black Sword runes would reunite through cooperation or conflict, whether the city-states of Jolston would achieve the unity and good governance that the Toran Republic had struggled toward. Those outcomes would be determined by the choices of the people involved and by the destiny gathering around them. All Tir could do was witness from distance, carrying his own burden, surviving through another day and another year, bearing the Soul Eater's curse as others before him had borne it, waiting for whatever fate had planned for him next. The story of the Gate Rune War and the fall of the Scarlet Moon Empire became legend, embellished and distorted as stories are when passed from generation to generation. Some versions made Tir a flawless hero, removing his doubts and mistakes to create inspiring tale of righteous triumph over corruption. Others focused on the horror of the Soul Eater, transforming Tir into cautionary tale about the price of power and the danger of true runes. The truth, as Apple had recorded it, was more complex than either extreme captured. Tir had been neither perfect hero nor cursed villain, but simply a young man thrust into circumstances beyond his preparation, doing his best with terrible burdens, making choices that were often difficult and sometimes wrong, achieving revolution's success through combination of determination, allies, and destiny. The Toran Republic itself became model studied by other regions considering reform or revolution. Its transition from empire to representative government, while far from smooth, had been less violent than many predicted. Its integration of diverse populations, humans and elves and dwarves, working together despite historical tensions, demonstrated that ethnic differences did not have to result in perpetual conflict. Its economic policies, designed to reduce inequality without destroying productive capacity, showed that reform did not require total dismantling of existing systems. Other nations watched and learned, some attempting to replicate aspects of the Toran model, others drawing opposite conclusions about what should be avoided. But ultimately, The Gate Rune War's significance transcended any specific political or economic lessons. It demonstrated that change was possible even against overwhelming odds, that ordinary people united by shared purpose could challenge and defeat entrenched power, that corruption did not have to be accepted as inevitable price of civilization. The 108 stars of destiny had gathered, had fought, had proven that destiny could be shaped rather than simply endured. Their revolution succeeded not because they were special or chosen, but because they refused to accept that the Empire's exploitation was natural or unchangeable. They saw suffering and decided to end it. They encountered injustice and chose to oppose it. They faced impossible odds and fought anyway, believing that the attempt mattered even if success could not be guaranteed. This legacy lived on long after the war's participants died or disappeared into wandering exile. It inspired subsequent generations to question authority that claimed divine right or traditional legitimacy. It encouraged people to believe that organized resistance could achieve what individual protest could not. It reminded those in power that their positions were not guaranteed, that exploitation created conditions for revolution, that ruling required actual service rather than merely extracting resources from those ruled. The Gate Rune War's echoes would reverberate through history, influencing conflicts and reforms that would not occur for decades or centuries after its conclusion. Tir's wandering eventually brought him to recognition that he would never escape the Soul Eater's curse through movement alone. Ted had tried that, had wandered for 300 years and found no peace, no distance sufficient to prevent the rune from claiming those he cared about. Isolation was not solution, but only postponement, extending survival at cost of never truly living. The curse could only end through transferring the rune to another bearer or through death, and Tir was not ready for either option. So he continued his wandering existence, not because it solved anything, but because he knew no other way to cope with the burden he carried. Occasionally, Tir would return secretly to the Toran Republic, observing from distance how the nation he had helped create was developing. He saw children growing up in relative peace and prosperity, their lives unmarked by the kind of corruption and suffering that had defined the Empire's final years. He saw trade flourishing between regions that had barely communicated under imperial rule. He saw schools teaching children to read and write, giving them opportunities that previous generations had been denied. He saw a functioning government attempting to serve its people rather than simply exploiting them. It was not perfect. No human institution ever was. But it was better, demonstrably better, than what the Scarlet Moon Empire had become. These observations brought Tir both comfort and pain. Comfort because they proved his sacrifice had achieved something real and lasting. Pain because he could not be part of it, could not openly enjoy what he had fought to create, could only observe from distance before moving on to prevent his presence from endangering those he had liberated. The Soul Eater's curse ensured that victory brought no peace, that success carried no reward beyond knowledge that others would benefit from his suffering. It was a terrible price, but it was the price true rune bearers paid for their power. And so Tir walked on, through the years and decades that followed the Gate Rune War, bearing the Soul Eater and its curse, existing on the margins of history he had helped shape, unknown to most of those whose lives his revolution had improved. He was not forgotten entirely. The Liberation Army's veterans remembered their young leader, spoke of him with respect and affection, wondered sometimes what had become of the bearer of the 108 stars. But to the next generation, to the children born after the war's end, Tir was just a name in historical accounts. one figure among many who contributed to overthrowing the Empire, his specific role less important than the collective achievement of revolution itself. This obscurity suited Tir, who had never wanted fame or recognition, who had accepted leadership only because refusing would have betrayed Odessa's faith in him and abandoned those who followed him. He had done what needed doing, paid the prices demanded of him, achieved the goals the war had pursued. That the achievement brought him exile rather than celebration was simply how the world worked when you bore a true rune. The cosmic forces that granted power did not care about human desires for happy endings. They pursued their own purposes through whatever bearers they chose, using humanity while remaining forever indifferent to individual suffering. As years turned to decades and decades to greater spans of time, as the Gate Rune War receded from living memory into distant history, Tir continued his endless journey. The Soul Eater kept him alive far beyond normal human lifespan, immortality being among the gifts that were curses true runes granted their bearers. He watched the Toran Republic mature and evolve, saw it face crises and overcome them, witnessed its transformation from revolutionary state into established nation, with its own traditions and institutions. He saw other wars erupt in distant regions, other revolutions born from similar patterns of exploitation and resistance, cosmic cycles repeating with different names but similar structures. Sometimes Tir encountered others from the Liberation Army, those few who had also been granted extended lifespans through true rune bearings or magical means. These meetings were bittersweet, reunions with people who remembered the war's immediate reality rather than its sanitized historical version, who understood what it had actually cost and what it had actually achieved. They would speak of old friends long dead, of battles won and lost, of the brief period when 108 stars gathered and destiny itself seemed to favor their cause. Then they would part again, each continuing their own solitary journeys, bound by shared history, but separated by circumstances that made prolonged companionship impossible. The world kept turning. New empires rose and fell. New heroes gathered stars and challenged tyrants. New true rune bearers appeared, claimed their power, paid their prices. The cycles continued as they always had and always would, cosmic patterns too large to be affected by any individual will or achievement. The Gate Rune War, which had seemed so all-consuming to those who fought it, became merely one turning point among many in the endless chronicle of human civilization's struggle between order and freedom, exploitation and justice, power and mercy. And through it all, Tir McDohl walked the world, bearing the Soul Eater, carrying the weight of everyone who had died to feed its hunger, alone with his power and his curse, remembered by history but unknown to the living, forever marked by the revolution he had led and the prices it had demanded. He was the hero who could not return home, the leader who could not enjoy what he had built, the victor who found no peace in victory. He was proof that destiny's gifts always came with costs, that true runes used humanity as much as humanity used them, that some burdens could never be set down but only endured through the long years until time itself finally granted the rest that mortal choices could not. This is where our story concludes, not with triumph or tragedy in their pure forms, but with something more complex and more true. The Scarlet Moon Empire fell, destroyed by its own corruption, and the revolution that rose to oppose it. The Toran Republic was born, built by idealists and veterans who believed better governance was possible. The 108 stars of destiny gathered, proved that cosmic forces could be aligned with human purposes, then scattered again to their separate fates, and Tir, who never wanted to be a hero, who accepted leadership only because refusing would betray those who trusted him, became legend while living in obscurity, his greatest achievements forever shadowed by the curse that made those achievements necessary. This is the nature of true runes and the burdens they impose. This is the price of gathering destiny's fragments and using them to reshape history. This is what it means to bear power that transcends human limitations while remaining human enough to suffer from that transcendence. The Gate Rune War ended, but for those who fought it, and especially for those who bore true runes through its prosecution, the consequences never stopped echoing forward through time. If this story resonates with you, if these tales of cosmic power and human suffering have moved you in ways that make you want to explore more of these legends and histories, consider supporting this journey of discovery. Share your thoughts, your reflections on what these stories mean, how they connect to struggles and triumphs in your own life. The past echoes forward into the present, and by understanding these chronicles, we better understand the patterns that shape our own world. Until the next story calls us to explore its depths, remember that every hero's journey begins with a single step, and every revolution starts with someone saying that the current order is not acceptable and that change must come, whatever the cost.